Coffee Chats with a Future Person. Written and narrated by John Van Stan. Copyright 2025 by John Van Stan. Published by the Press of a Ridiculous Man. Chatter 1. An Introduction to Pffffft. Voltaire's 20-mile-tall alien Micromegas once told us tiny humans, quote,
"Oh, intelligent atoms, you must no doubt taste pure joys on your planet, for having so little matter and appearing to be entirely spirit. You must live out your life thinking and loving. Nowhere have I seen true bliss, but it is here without a doubt."
End quote. In the spring of 2025, I had the privilege of presenting an invited lecture at an esteemed institute nearby, one celebrated for its substantial and long-standing contributions to science. Now, as the following story has very little to do with anything scientific, in the strict and current definition of the word, I will, out of courtesy, refrain from naming this institution. This discretion, I hope, will spare them any embarrassment that might arise from an association with the set of bizarre occurrences and conversations that follow. After my lecture, I was escorted through the halls by the dean of a certain college. However, during this tour, the dean left me alone for a short time, excusing themselves to address some pressing internal affairs. I realized within a few seconds that my solitude was an illusion. Another person was standing nearby, no more than a few steps away. They were engrossed in reading the flyers plastered across the wall. Something in their atmosphere or their planet was undeniably peculiar. Perhaps it was the kind of intensity with which they scrutinized every flyer. Or maybe it was the subtle, nearly ethereal manner in which they composed themselves. It could have been the way they had artfully blended into the grandeur of the hall, or just their ambiguous aura. Whatever the cause, it all pointed to extreme eccentricity. Though I had noticed them, they seemed unaware of my presence. In fact, I felt quite confident that they had absolutely no conception of my existence. A part of me hesitated, fearing intrusion should I materialize myself into their world unwanted, yet curiosity won and I approached. Our introduction was telling. Shortly after the polite hellos, ample empirical evidence arose to support my hypothesis regarding their uncommon nature. First, when I asked their name, I barely understood what they said. The sound that ensued resembled the expulsion of air from an overly tight balloon. Something like Pffffft. Doing my best to be polite, I asked them to repeat it a few times. It was clear after several clarifications that they were serious and that the gust of syllables was indeed their name. Hoping to guess better at what the appropriate pronunciation might be, my mind sought assistance from geographic linguistic context. I asked their origin. To my astonishment, they claimed with a very honest expression to come from the not-so-distant future, identifying as a, quote, future person. I was naturally skeptical, but I let this simmer on my mental back burner and asked, how does a future person spell fliffle? After they corrected my mispronunciation, they said it was spelled RG6Y48-CS7GERP. Names with numbers. Truly the future must be a wondrous place. My curiosity grew at such a rate that I found myself unable to examine my thoughts before they manifested into speech. Good God, I said. What is the state of phonetics in your time? How does that spelling relate to its pronunciation? Surely, please understand, I ask with good intention. I aim to be respectful and, well, to do so, I'd like to be able to correctly pronounce your name. They replied, oddly enough, with the slightest hint of condescension. Ah, In our era, all phonetics have been abolished, deemed discriminatory during the Great War of Acceptance. And please, just call me Pffft. I had never heard such a sentence. At this point, I invited them to coffee, my treat. On the return of the Deanly escort, I spared them the introduction to Pffft and diplomatically excused myself for a meeting. I wanted no other attendees to this coffee chat, especially not academic ones. Experience has taught me that academic witnesses tend to, inadvertently no doubt, constrain or twist the more eccentric streams of conversation. The dean departed with a cordial nod, and I walked in the opposite direction, out of and away from the main institute in search of a coffee shop. A certain quirk of all esteemed academic locales is that they host a multitude of coffee shops, yet only a handful serve the genuine beverage. After passing several of these decoy establishments, bustling with students slurping from oversized cups of vividly tinted, frothy concoctions, we found a literal coffee shop. Fortuitously, it was almost empty. We had been walking in comfortable and companionable silence. As we entered, I asked if they knew much about our time. They replied, "Of course. I have studied the history of your century. I know a few of your time's vernacular." We approached the barista. I asked what would like, to which they replied, "Pffft." The barista, after a moment of mental dusting, recognized the ancient internet jest and let out a polite chuckle that sounded as dusty as Pffft's 2020s-ish vernacular. I chuckled too, joined in the amusement, and ordered 2 Pffffs, please. When the barista asked our names, this future person let forth their unique gust of phonetic curiosities. The barista stared in response, but my companion's attention had shifted, noticing that there were flyers of a different sort on the walls of this establishment. The barista then looked at me. I said, "John," to which the barista replied, 2 coffees for John. We sat down, and I only allowed a few free moments before I asked, "Can you tell me how many years ahead you come from?" They paused and said, "You would not understand our dating system. Your era's non-physical calendar is rooted in no cosmic event, just a slipshod sequence of carbon sacrifices and historical fictions. Ours begins from the known thermodynamic origin of this universe." After a slight change of expression, "The year I come from is pronounced Alta Far Befa." Is that a number? It was the only question that came to mind. "It is a positional phonemic sequence," they said flatly. "More expressive and more compressible than your numbers. The sounds mean, well, it doesn't translate. Assign a number if you must." "Okay," I said. "I'll call it the year 10,000. We looked at each other. They did not like this label. They wordlessly wrote something on the napkin, a series of symbols. I picked it up, folded it, and tucked it away for future reference. Then I changed the subject. "So, what were you in the future?" Lowering my voice for the last phrase. "Did you have a job or some specialized training?" "I did. I still do, of course," they replied. "But here and now my training is of little use. I have a doctorate in astro-ecophysics. I am what is generally called an intergalactic naturalist." Being somewhat of a naturalist myself, without any prefixorial terminology, I was intrigued. "Interesting. Of course, I'm aware of the meaning of the term intergalactic, but only in imagination and certainly not in experience. To avoid any imaginative misconceptions on my part, could you please tell me more about your profession?" "It's like the role of academic naturalists here at..." institution name redacted. But on a grander scale, instead of studying the ecosystems and species on Earth alone, I study them on a universal scale, across various planets, across various galaxies. And who in the world, or the universe rather, who employs you? I interrupted. An agency called the Intergalactic Biodiversity Service. The IBS? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, but it's our job to prevent any cosmic indigestion, if you catch my drift, Pffft said, their tone as steady and convinced as ever. We monitor and protect biodiversity across planets and galaxies, ensuring no ecosystem reaches a point of no return. I see, I responded with a smirk. So with all that cosmic expertise, you must be quite knowledgeable about our Earth's biodiversity and the problems we face today. Do you think you may have some insights into how we can resolve some of our thornier environmental problems? Pfft hesitated, then said, In the vastness of my work, Earth was not a focal study. I paused to sip my coffee before responding. Well, I began, gathering my thoughts. Despite Earth not being your focus, surely the fundamentals are the same. The same basic physics and chemistry that govern processes throughout the universe. They should allow you to apply your expansive knowledge here, right? My companion had also been sipping their coffee, and squinting, maybe wincing while I was talking. I couldn't tell, but after a hard swallow they said, Physics and chemistry, the same throughout the universe? Yes. Don't the laws of nature, and the elements that form life, maintain some sort of consistency across all planets, solar systems, and galaxies? Again, with that slight touch of condescension, replied, It must be a common misconception of this era. I see. The thinkers of this time have not yet realized that physics, chemistry, and other natural sciences are not universally uniform. Even the basic elements on which all life on a planet is built are not consistent across all planets throughout the universe. For instance, although I am a highly educated and experienced IBS worker born on Earth, I do not even know the major elements of Earth. You never learned the elements for your own planet? After another squinty, wincy sip, they replied, No. Why would I? I had no need for them. And, they added cryptically, Earth in my time has many reasons to be avoided. I see, I mused, then. Well, what about the technology that transported you to your research sites? Can we discuss that? I promise not to scoop any future innovators of their intellectual property. I know nothing about it. I am an intergalactic naturalist, not an engineer. Pfft looked at me in the manner of looking through me, their pupils seeming uninterested in achieving a precise focal point. Here was someone who, in any other circumstance, could have been considered the foremost expert in universal ecosystems. But when it came to their own home planet, they were almost as clueless as any city dweller who only touched nature to eat its fruits, or to eat something made from these fruits. I admit honestly that I would have been disappointed if the conversation had turned into clever and clean solutions for our current problems, and even more disappointed if had gifted me technological secrets that I had promised never to share. Given my failures at keeping lesser secrets, I'm not certain I could have kept such secrets anyhow. Relieved and grateful at having avoided a test of my abilities to bear the weight of world-changing secrets, I probed further into knowledge. All this said, I began with a hint of mischief in my voice, You must have seen some truly bizarre worlds in your travels. What's the strangest planet you've ever studied? The strangest planet that I've ever researched was undeniably Bliblion, home to the Blupium-based lifeforms. The Bliblonians, as they're known, are fascinating. Their diversity ranges from tiny organisms at subatomic scales to massive beings rivaling the size of Earth's vastest aspen groves. The IBS requested that I go there to research a troublesome species of habitatorers who... Pffft, I interjected in my best phoneticless attempt to pronounce their name. While I'm still wrapping my head around the vastness of Bliblonians, what on earth, or rather Bliblion, is a habitatorer? Pffft assumed a pedantic air that was very reminiscent of a current-day professor I knew. Then they said, Imagine a life form that, over eons, evolves the uncanny ability to mold and shape any environment into its ideal, most comfortable habitat. These are what intergalactic naturalists have classified as habitatorers. Not content with adapting to their surroundings, they actively and profoundly transform them to suit their needs. As their capabilities grow, habitatorers inevitably harness technologies to aid in their endeavors. Here, paused while looking into their swirling, chilling coffee, as if thinking a little more about the meaning of their words. Then they looked up at me and said, This mastery often comes at a cost to the entire planet. While turning any habitat into their most comfortable living conditions, they unintentionally, perhaps carelessly, become adept at many forms of destruction. This concept sounded familiar. As I mulled it over, I felt this was not just a whimsical term from a distant future. It could hold significant value for our understanding of behaviors across the cosmos, even in our natural sciences here on Earth. So they are the architects of their surroundings, but with potential for severe unintended consequences. Precisely, nodded. While they can create paradisical environments for themselves, the repercussions on other life forms and the natural balance can be catastrophic. In the wake of their words came a rich, intoxicating aroma of freshly brewed coffee, potent and heady, blending seamlessly with the warm and inviting scent of baked goods cooling on the counter, preparing to ensnare the next discerning customer. Previously mundane sounds asserted their presence, the gentle murmurs of conversation, the delicate clinking of ceramic cups, and even the oft-ignored melodies playing softly in the background now commanded my attention and joined its sensory harmonics to those of the aromas. Even the rhythmic whisper of a nearby HVAC vent added its subtle touch. Every sensory note and nuance playing a part in an existential symphony that wrapped around and embraced us. While enjoying this ever-present and accessible symphony as if it were not so, a question arose to my mind, and I let it slip out. What kind of trouble were these Bliblonian habitatorers up to? Yes. The, Bloopins. My companion looked up, or rather, looked back out from within themselves, seeming to have been lost in the same symphony into which I had been swept. The Bloopins, these are the habitatorers, I probed. Yes, the Bloopins are a prime example of a habitatorer species, began, their tone gradually shifting from reflective to instructive. Throughout their evolution, habitatorers develop not only the capacity, but a compulsive drive for maximal comfort. It becomes an unyielding pursuit that permeates every part of their existence. For the Bloopins, this meant not just altering landscapes and constructing elaborate dwellings. It extended into the very fabric of their daily lives, down to the minutiae. Intrigued, I nudged them for more. Minutiae? Indeed. Every single aspect, every single preference, has its roots in the pursuit of pleasure and ease. Consider the texture of the seats they choose, the ambient temperature, the light's color and intensity in every part of their shelters, or even... Here, paused dramatically. Their nourishment. "Oh, food!" I exclaimed, sensing where this might be heading. My chuckles subsided into words. Always a universal weak spot. So, what was it for the Bloopins? What was their gastronomic Achilles heel? Began to manifest signs of enjoying the conversation, or at least enjoying the act of leading me on. A twinkle of amusement arose in their eyes, albeit mixed with melancholy and perhaps a touch of caffeine sensitivity. Their deepest culinary indulgence was something called flosh. Ugh, flosh? They ignored my outburst and continued. But it wasn't just about the flosh. It was the narrative it wove around their culture, their status, and their ever-increasing desire for luxury. Still, it was the Bloopins' flosh lust that eventually attracted the attention of the IBS. I leaned forward, more genuinely curious now. But what exactly is this flosh? And why is it so important to Bloopins? Was it as important to other Bliblonian life? No. Most Bliblonian life cannot harvest flosh, lacking the tools, the physiology to digest it healthily, or the strength to subdue it. Some few other species on the planet will eat flosh here and there. Only Bloopins strove to eat it often, daily. In fact, towards the end, most of them were convinced that they must eat flosh multiple times a day. You are answering my questions in reverse order, I interrupted, kindly and jestingly. I hope this is your way of working up to describing what flosh is. Flosh, they began, is a rich, delectably tender material harvested from the bodies of various native species of Bliblion. Flosh is marbled with flavors that are said to dance upon the Bloopin palate. It was first consumed as a luxury, for rare and weighty celebrations. The exact creatures that provide flosh are diverse, but what they have in common is the incredibly flavorful and sought-after body bits. These bits are flosh. I couldn't help but chuckle again, as I looked around at the ham and cheese croissants sitting by the barista, who currently looked relieved to be taking an order from some pretty normal-seeming folks. Sounds like the Bliblonian version of our Kobe beef, or maybe the truffle of meats. Sounds delicious. Pfft blinked in acknowledgement, but their mood did not mirror mine. All fitting analogies, yes. However, it wasn't just the taste. Eating flosh became a testament to one's sophistication. As their technology and means grew, so did their insatiable desire for flosh. It was no longer to console them after victories over their gravest and greatest challenges. No, they wanted it everywhere, from street stalls to feasts in the grandest halls. Intrigued by the unfolding narrative, I pondered aloud. So this flosh was a status symbol? Exactly. Consuming flosh became synonymous with wealth and power, with affluence, the ultimate achievement of comfort. Their rich marbled texture and the depth of flavor were second to none in Bloopin society. To begin excusing the excess, which is what habitators end up being exceptionally good at too. The most influential and affluent among the Bloopins began campaigns to convince the public that flosh was a necessary source of this and of that. And, Even though all generations of bloopins before had survived in fine health without flosh, showing the absurdity of these claims, it did not matter. It was not long until even the lowest forms of flosh were the most common food of the poor, and the highest forms of flosh, the most common food of the rich. Wow, to feed everyone flosh all the time must mean that these Bliblonian organisms were easily farmed. Absolutely not, responded my coffee companion with immediacy. These creatures whose bodies grow flosh require vast stretches of habitat and plentiful resources. A realization dawned on me then. Feeling like I had the expertise to leap to the ending, I said, "And I assume this flosh lust led to overhunting, or habitat destruction?" "You're on the right path," they responded. "But it wasn't just about hunting or habitat. Their desire for flosh began to dictate their entire way of life. This flosh lust would be the start of a chain of events that neither the bloopins nor the rest of Bliblion could have foreseen." The tale, hardly having moved beyond its introductory elements, already felt fascinating and tragic, a dance of desire and consequence. I sipped my coffee, now lukewarm, and encouraged to move into the rising action. I playfully asked, "So the IBS requested you visit Bliblion. Why? What was your purpose there, besides, hopefully, enjoying a flosh feast or two?" With a sigh, responded, "The IBS rarely intervenes with habitatorers. The vastness of the universe and the sheer number of evolving worlds and species makes it impossible to address every concern that arises. Moreover, the majority of concerns end up taking care of themselves. It is often an illusion or misconception that any intervention in nature is necessary. However, when a species exhibits extreme behaviors, planetary threat level extremes, you see, the IBS takes a keen interest." Planetary threat level extremes. Flosh. I mused aloud, accidentally loosening the corner of my mouth too much to keep my sip of coffee from slightly leaking out. My companion continued, "It is. Extreme habitator behaviors can drastically alter the course of a planet's evolution, sometimes leading to complete ecological collapse." "So you were sent to... what? To stop them? To curb their flosh lust?" Shook their head. "Not to stop them or to intervene in any of their actions, no. My role was observational. I was to determine whether the bloopin flosh lust would lead to a natural equilibrium, a course correction of sorts, or if it was the beginning of an irreversible decline." "What happens if the extreme cases are, well, as extreme as they appear to be at first? Surely the IBS intervenes somehow." "In these rare cases, my observations must be used, per standard intergalactic naturalist methods, to estimate the expected biodiversity losses, to identify and save the species most threatened, then remove a community of these organisms, oftentimes including the habitator species, to an interstellar facility, a sanctuary where intergalactic biodiversity is cherished and maintained by the IBS." Fascinating. And at Bliblion, what did you discover? "While there, I observed what I have described, and of course more, their rituals, technological advancements, and so on. It was during my observation that something pivotal occurred, a seemingly small advancement in flosh cooking. Well, it changed everything." Here we were interrupted by the sounds of my stomach. I was feeling very hungry. I couldn't help it. I hadn't eaten breakfast, for over my career I realized that my guest lectures are better when done on an empty stomach. "Sorry, I think that was my stomach's attempt at politely interrupting you to ask whether you'd like a bagel. I sure would. Yes, I would. Thank you. Feeling only slightly embarrassed by the intrusion of my bodily needs, I motioned to the barista and ordered 2 everything bagels. I stood off to the side, waiting, observing as the barista took a quality knife, then sliced each bagel with precision. The cut halves were placed in a toaster, wherefrom an aromatic tapestry of everything spices filled the air. Sesame, onion, garlic, poppy seeds, each ingredient added something distinct to create the intoxicating experience. It felt funny, this aroma, as it seemed too obviously intent on demonstrating to my nose, and any other sensory system connected to it, that the most simple and humble of foods can sometimes offer the most profound experiences. I watched as the barista, now wearing as content a smile as American baristas are capable, generously smeared cream cheese over the toasted surface of each bagel half. It felt almost ceremonial. Here was a humble treat, toasted to perfection, fragrant with spices and generously endowed with cream cheese. In that moment it struck me how bizarre it was that such a simple feast, a bagel that promised us everything, and with cream cheese too, how did it lack the fervent devotion in us that the Bluepins felt towards their flosh? These 2 promises of everything were placed before me, and I returned with them to Pffffft. After a few crunching bites, they began the next round of conversation. Flosh was a sticky food. I mean, it left very sticky residues on all the cooking surfaces. The Bluepins found it vexing and laborious to remove these residues after every meal. Remember, they now ate flosh morning, noon, and night at least. Thus, one day, a small set of Bluepin scientists created a chemical they called Threem that would prevent the flosh from sticking to any cooking surface. This small innovation was everywhere celebrated. The final discomfort of flosh annihilated, eh? I spoke, my mouth actively processing a bite of bagel. To an extent, there were many bodily discomforts from such overconsumption of flosh, but these were not researched and certainly not cured. The biggest problem for the brightest Bloopian minds was to prevent flosh from sticking to surfaces hot enough to cook it. I laughed at the specificity. Paused for a moment, taking a slow bite of their own bagel. After swallowing, they continued. Every planet in its unique evolution often develops a universal solvent. On Earth, it's water. For Bliblion, it's called Blibzel, named after the planet with the standard "sil" suffix per intergalactic naturalist standards. This solvent, like water on Earth, carries life's essential compounds, aids in various biochemical processes, and acts as a conduit for nutrients and wastes. It flows through the veins of every living being and non-living part of Bliblion. I nodded and chewed. Sounds vital. Very much like water indeed. Please go on. It is, they affirmed. But here's where the tragedy unfolds. Threem, this non-stick innovation, while effective in its designed purpose, was a poison in nearly every other natural circumstance. Once introduced into the environment, it seeped into the Blibzel. Given the interconnectedness of life and the solvent on Bliblion, the poison spread rapidly and extensively. It became a planetary issue so quickly that it was not noticed until after it was everywhere. This chemical, which no technology on Bliblion could expunge, now flowed through the veins of every life form. It was even falling from the skies like earth and rain or snow, and irreparably altering the biological framework of the entire planet. The weight of their revelation hung heavily between us, leaving my bagel momentarily forgotten. So you're saying that? nodded gravely. Yes, the rampant and unregulated use of the non-stick compound poisoned the very lifeblood of Bliblion. The ramifications of removing the last nagging challenge of comforting food were, well, catastrophic. Staring into the remnants of my bagel, the magnitude of such an oversight was overwhelming. Here we were, celebrating the simple pleasure of an everything bagel, while on another planet, a seemingly trivial culinary convenience was currently unraveling or would eventually unravel the very fabric of life. Did you tell them? And when they understood the problem, did they stop using it? Did they stop making it? I asked. Their answer to my multiple questions was direct and simple, as if rehearsed by procedure. The IBS approved my request to notify the Blupin leadership, and I did so promptly. But no, they did not stop. Certainly they didn't just do nothing, or ignore you. Did they not believe you? They did not ignore me, and they believed the IBS reports. Our report writers are quite skilled, and their writing above all else is clear and convincing no matter the language. Pause to sip from an empty cup of coffee, and to realize this emptiness. After this realization, they started again. They did do something strange. Instead of stopping the production of the chemical, they ran around Bliblion measuring the concentrations of the poison everywhere. Then they would write new articles about where they found threme, and how much threme was measured there. This was the new obsession of the most educated Blupin researchers, and of their media. All the while, I interjected, the poison spread, and even increased in concentration within their own veins. Again correct. An analyst at the IBS shared a curious opinion with me. They said that this habitat-rich species seems to have achieved a dangerous new stage of development, one where the species would rather quantify its power to destroy than to correct their actions. They suggested that the reason Blupins sought for the extent and magnitude of their poisoning of Bliblion, rather than save themselves, was out of a blind pride, a desire to see exactly how powerful they were. Pffft stopped and felt their shirt pocket, for they were wearing a very nerdy shirt with a single breast pocket. The pocket was empty. With their hand still over the empty pocket and a thumb dipping in and out of it, they said, I remember recording that idea in my mini-tab, for I found it a fascinating topic of future intergalactic naturalist study. I could tell that they had lost whatever contained this note, and likely many others beyond my limited earthbound naturalist imagination. Sorry to see that you've lost your notes. Pfft. At least you remember the idea. If you don't mind me asking, what happened to your notes? They put their hand down to the final piece of bagel, ate it, then looked at me directly, saying, I do not know, but I do not need them to finish my story about Bliblion, if you would like to hear its conclusion. I sighed, noticing that this eclectic conversation felt like it was on its concluding leg. As I sighed, I also nodded, saying, Yes, of course. Please go on. The damages were extensive, their voice maintaining the flat level of enthusiasm with which our conversation began. The non-stick compound endangered nearly all forms of life on Bliblion. However, the planet itself, through its own slow processes and circulation of the universal solvent, will eventually clear the poison. Through rock percolations, the ingestion and excretion of generations of hardier organisms, and atmospheric distillations. These interactions and many more will, over thousands of years, cleanse the Blibsel of Threme. And the Blupins? They were doomed, concluded. Blupins were only resilient organisms in that they can alter habitats to their comfort. Like most habitators across the universe, they were not hardy in such a way as to survive thousands of years of cleansing a universal solvent of any strong pollutant. It's not like they were Glyptodices, after all. No, that they certainly were not. Silence fell between us, filled only by the ambient noise of the cafe and the distant sound of traffic. The hardy life form mentioned, at least that's what I assumed the word meant, was wasted on my unprepared and perhaps unlearned ear, the second its sound dissipated into the ambience. I took my last bagel bite. The Blupins died out. Ah, perked up slightly. The IBS acted, of course. Those organisms with the lowest concentrations of the compound were transferred to the IBS's Intergalactic Biodiversity Conservatory. Other intergalactic naturalists are searching for untainted blipsel, in the hopes of decontaminating the blood of some future Blupin offspring. They will no doubt find it, for the universe is wide. That's good to hear, I said as the bagel passed from bite to bolus with a gulp. A few moments of silence passed, just enough of it to indicate that the story in its current conversational form had concluded. Thank you for the sustenance and the caffeine, they said, tone unchanged. I sat up somewhat quickly and awkwardly, surprised by what appeared to be a sudden end to a most preposterously interesting conversation between strangers. Surely you have a meeting to get to, I asked, growing aware of my own shirked responsibilities. No, I do not. As we are done eating and caffeinating, I will return to the flyers I was reading in the halls where we met. Their answer was as matter-of-fact as their departure, leaving no room for further inquiry. I watched them walk away for a moment before calling out, "Pfft, will you caffeinate with me next week? Same time, same place?" They paused, then turned their face unreadable. I will, for as long as I am in your time. With that they turned away, their figure diminishing into the crowd, leaving behind a quiet space that seemed emptier than before. Chapter 2: The Great War of Acceptance. Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov once sighed about humanity's grand ambition. Quote, "Mankind as a whole has always striven to organize a universal state. There have been many great nations with great histories, but the more highly they were developed, the more unhappy they were. For they felt more acutely than other people the craving for worldwide union." End quote. The week passed rapidly by, and the day of the next coffee chat arrived. I left early in the morning to catch a train to the other side of town. Boarding the Red Line, I felt that odd feeling one develops when they hope that they are establishing a new and healthy routine. This is what it must feel like to start a gym membership, or to purposely purchase more vegetables in one's weekly grocery trip than usual. One feels different in the familiar grocery line when one's cart is different. I felt different on the familiar Red Line. It seemed that the Red Line had become a living metaphor for the city's veins, as it pulsated with the day's rhythms. Floating within a metal cell, constrained to go whither this industrial vein permitted, I knew the tissues into which I would innervate. I ventured towards the prestigious yet unnamed university campus of yesterweek. The train car's rhythmic clacking mirrored my escalating thoughts. Each track joint a heartbeat in the anticipation of what lay ahead. Around me, the everyday commuters immersed in their routines were unaware of the adventure that I was embarking upon, a departure from the realms of normalcy. How could they be aware, after all, when I had no luggage grander than a standard backpack, and no supplies beyond a water bottle? Disembarking from the train and into the heart of the campus, I was immersed in a vibrant academic theater. Bookstores and cafes lined the streets. Everything, including these stores, the trash bins in the right-of-way, and even the power poles, were covered with posters of various sizes proclaiming various values. They all seemed well-intentioned, yet it struck me that in my anecdotal experience, I only saw one person who'd ever shown any genuine interest in actually reading any of them. As I strolled toward the coffee shop, watching others, a pattern became evident. People only seemed to either put up posters or to take them down. No one seemed to read them, to pause long enough to truly engage with their content. Their attention was fleeting at best, only long enough to decide whether the poster merited its place or should be torn down. This observation led to an involuntary contemplation. There seemed to be more pages disregarded in public view than disregarded in the university library, including its expansive digital archives. Could it be, I pondered, that more paper and ink were sacrificed in this ephemeral tack-or-tear display than in feeding the intellectual hunger of the student and faculty body? What if the count included the pages swept into gutters or crumpled in trash cans? Lost in these thoughts, I arrived at the coffee shop and glimpsed through the window as I approached the doorway. There sat, already perched at a table, surveying the room with peculiarly mechanical head turns. Their head moved with precise jerky motions of a sprinkler mechanism, while their eyes remained eerily stationary, reminiscent of an owl's focused gaze. Somehow it looked still authentic and human, but just barely. Their head's mechanical course was currently moving away from the entryway. So I walked in, and in the short time lost during my entrance, I noticed had fixed their gaze on a small group of students. It sounded like the students were discussing whether Schrodinger's cat preferred cream or sugar in its hypothetical coffee.
Given that cats have a clear general preference for dairy, it would be improbable, to the point of practical impossibility, that any cat in any closed box containing 2 coffees, identical in every way except that each contained a different additive, sugar or cream, would be revealed to have chosen the sugary option once opened.
Enthusiastically ejaculated one of the students. An odd advocate for cats' love of sugar arose from across the table and continued the debate. It was evident that was enjoying the absurdity of early 21st century academia, an amusement park of intellectual exercises. Walking nearer, I noticed a small mountain of colorful posters spread across the table under their elbows. "Good morning. I see you've been collecting," I remarked, gesturing toward the array of posters. My attempt at pronouncing their name was louder than intended, causing the shop to fall quiet for a moment, followed by a few chuckles. They were still looking at the students who were conversing, but who had stopped after the wind was broken by my greeting. Without looking at me, my companion replied, "Yes, these are fascinating. Each one that I have collected here is a testament to the techniques employed, that will be employed, during the Great War of Acceptance." I pulled up a chair, my curiosity piqued. Techniques? In what way? Finally turned their attention away from the students and towards me. Their gaze was piercing as it was serene. "Between your time and mine, there will be a war of narratives, of information, and the shaping of collective consciousness. The Great War of Acceptance was not just a conflict of physical force or ideologies. These posters," they gestured, causing some of the topmost papers to flutter, "echo the same patterns. They are more than they appear to be. They are crude instruments of influence, subtly shaping thoughts and preferences under the guise of information or advocacy." I leaned forward to look at the papers, perhaps to discern a pattern or see a nefarious symbol emerge. Nothing happened. They were just posters. "So you're saying these posters are what, Similar to propaganda tools of the future?
Pfft.
Nodded.
During the Great War of Acceptance, similar methods were used, but on a grander and more sophisticated scale. Each one of these represents a perspective vying for acceptance, subtly influencing the minds of those who glance at them. They create an environment where it appears that all ideas are accepted, hiding in plain sight the process where certain ideas become normalized, others marginalized.
The coffee shop buzzed with the low hum of conversations and cup clinking, providing a mundane backdrop to our increasingly interesting discussion. My companion added,
"Imagine a tool of this nature that can marginalize any idea, certainly all local ideas, through the appearance of accepting all ideas."
I let loose an impressed breath, although my mind could imagine no such tool, and I wasn't entirely sure I understood exactly what they'd meant to say. I certainly could not imagine such a tool in the form of a poster, staple gun to a coarse wooden pole, overlying chunks of dried and discarded gum, fluttering in an atmosphere of car exhaust. In the hopes of igniting some imaginative abilities beyond this, I picked up one of the posters and tried to examine it with new eyes. As I held the poster, its bright colors and bold fonts seemed to jump out at me despite its worn and dirty state. I found myself examining its edges more than its central message, which was plain and platitudinous despite the loud font choice. The edges were frayed and mottled with grime. Layers of city soot had settled into the creases, giving it a tired gray patina that hadn't extended far beyond a few inches from its grimy perimeter. Some of the ink was smudged and streaked by rain and the careless hands of passers-by. Yet beneath its vibrant paper, perhaps within it, I sought for a deeper, more insidious message. Again, no success. When I looked back up at Pffft, they had been perusing a small cardboard sign in a small patch of urban grass outside. It was streaked with various proclamations and mud. There were so many single-sentenced catchphrases, one above another, that I briefly pondered over the literal mass of the words in ink. Was it that mass of ink that had caused the cardboard to lean so heavily on its slender metal posts? The cardboard had softened from countless damp nights and baked in the sun until it had faded to a ghostly shade of its original state. A solitary blade of grass pierced through a dog-eared corner, as if nature itself sought to reclaim the space it occupied. These narratives here, I mused, holding the poster aloft to bring their attention back to the conversation. Are they harmful?
Pfft.
Turned their attention back to me.
These posters in themselves aren't inherently harmful, they replied. It's the intention and the effect that determine their value. Some seek to open minds, while others aim to close them, to cement certain ideas so deeply that they become unquestioned truths. The Great War of Acceptance was about recognizing this dynamic and using it to achieve mass unification. How do you open and close all minds with a single tool? It was a war where the most potent weapon was not a sword or a gun, but a compelling concept so seamlessly woven into the everyday societal fabric that it could effectively disconnect people's perspectives of the worlds from which they came from the world they wanted to achieve. This weapon reshapes perceptions that were rooted in innumerable pasts towards a singularly envisioned future.
Fascinating, I murmured, my gaze drifting over the poster board at the back wall of the coffee shop. And what were the outcomes of this war? How did it shape society? Pfft's response was tinged with a hint of solemnity.
The outcomes were profound and far-reaching. But let's order our coffees. I have found that some conversations require caffeine.
Nodding in agreement, I went to the barista to order our drinks. It was the same one as last week, and he remembered us. If he hadn't remembered us at first sight, he was certainly reminded of last week's odd interaction, when my companion's name erupted from my mouth a few moments ago. The barista seemed relieved that I came to the bar alone. The order was according to standard procedure. Just coffee, a stimulant with no additives to dilute or alter the effect. Returning to our table with 2 steaming cups, I sat them down. The conversation had blossomed nicely as far as I was concerned, and by that I mean eccentrically. Our coffee cups steamed gently between us, forming our own little cosmos within the cafe. From my side of the thin, fragrant fog of fresh coffee, I began. You mentioned the Great War of Acceptance last time, so I'm especially curious. What was it about? Did it begin in the typical fashion, bullets and bombs? Then this new, what? Should we call it a weapon? This new weapon enters the fray and changes everything. Incorrect. Pffft, took a careful sip of their coffee. Their cup was well filled. This time period currently lacks the intergalactic scale datasets on war. What you describe is indeed a type of war, but it is one of many types under the umbrella theory built by the IBS. War, then, is also studied by intergalactic naturalists? I asked while arching my brows. Of course. Is conflict not a part of nature? My companions stated, their voice carrying the weight of indisputable fact. It's intriguing, your era's perspective. It presumes that your scientific theories apply universally across all manifestations of nature, yet simultaneously regards fundamental aspects of nature as mere constructs of the human mind. I let out a good-natured laugh, the sort that acknowledges both the absurdity and sharp truth in their words. Well, when you frame it like that, it does make my current earthbound education seem remarkably narrow in scope. Pfft, didn't seem to react much to my humor, but I continued. I'm intrigued still. Please, tell me more about this IBS theory of war. Both earthly historical records and intergalactic records reveal a consistent theme. The character of warfare mirrors its instigators. They began, their tones scholarly. This theme persists across planets and their histories. Advanced civilizations, regardless of their origins, engage in the brutality of physical warfare, not due to an inherent violence. Rather, they do so under the influence of their most base constituents, the wealthiest in material. These materially driven elites, insatiably craving more physical wealth, reshape the entire societal structure to serve their ends. They ensure that every role from janitor to general primarily serves to craft, maintain, and operate an arsenal of formidable physical weapons. This is done to intimidate those who would challenge their greed, and to harm rivals seeking to seize their hoarded physical treasures. Conversely, when societies are steered by leaders with concerns that transcend material wealth, the character of warfare transforms. Conflict remains inevitable, but these leaders, recognizing the power of collective beliefs, shift the battleground from the tangible to the intangible, towards the realm of cultural consciousness. The Great War of Acceptance was this type of conflict. I took a thoughtful sip of coffee, letting the warmth of the drink and these words settle in. How do societies end up in this Great War of Acceptance, if it wasn't about conquering territories or amassing wealth? Today it seems we have materially driven elites for the most part. Maybe that's why I have trouble grasping this other kind of war. Pfft, nodded. Indeed, between your time and mine, materially driven elites will consolidate control over all nations on Earth. Eventually, they masterfully mold the sectors of society concerned with physical things, construction,
engineering, maintenance, etc., to suit their materialistic pursuits. However, they then hit a bottleneck. The overemphasis on material gain starts to undermine the integrity of non-material sectors, particularly any sector responsible for critical thinking and the formulation and testing of ideas. Before my time, it began eroding the public's trust in the intellectual endeavors and their cultural perspectives. I leaned forward, intrigued. So the material elites realized they needed the intellectual elites? Yes, continued. Pffft. But it wasn't just about tapping into their intellectual labor, or cloaking their actions in academic prestige. The materially driven elites faced a deeper crisis. Their legitimacy was being questioned, and the narratives justifying their accumulation of wealth were under intense scrutiny. They needed the intellectual elites to reconstruct and fortify these narratives, to persuade the public their socio-economic order was both natural and inevitable. Absorbing the strategic pivot, I asked, "But how did they manage to align these intellectual elites with their goals without resorting to outright coercion? After all, wouldn't true intellectuals be resistant to such manipulation?" "The process was subtle, of course," explained, while threading their fingers together. "It started with funding research that shifted academic focus towards areas that served their material interests. Scholarships, endowed chairs, and generous research grants all nudged academic inquiry away from critically examining materialistic pursuits and their impacts on society." I thought about my own experience with grant applications, the programs that I wrote them for, and the broader impacts I used to convince these programs to fund my research. My collaborators and I always included monetary values to justify our research aims, for example. Even when we already had physical estimates of the study targets themselves. A large estimate of possible stormwater runoff reductions only mattered, for example, if it had a correspondingly large and likely price tag. When we hadn't done this, our proposals seemed more likely to be rejected due to diminished perceived impact, or for being perceived as too risky an investment of tax dollars. "So, a diversion of sorts?" I asked. "Exactly," affirmed. "But it was more than that. It was fundamentally about redefining the very value of ideas, of thinking. Research that promised immediate commercial application and returns was glorified by all institutions of power and media, whereas theoretical pursuits, especially in the social sciences and humanities, received scant attention unless they stirred controversy, and especially discontent. Intellectuals were incentivized to pursue practical endeavors that dovetailed neatly with the interests of the wealthy, effectively marginalizing those who dared to pursue questions outside of the economic order. By the date of Alta Far Seifa, universities no longer weighed their thinkers by their thoughts, but by the material wealth they could generate." They noticed I winced at the date and jotted something down on the napkin, a bunch of symbols. "Thanks," I muttered. "I was going to guess the year 10,010? No response. "That's unsettling," I said, returning to the subject, the simplicity of the term feeling insufficient to describe the scale of manipulation involved. A sense of familiarity with this future was creeping in. I thought it best to ignore the feeling and suppress the discomfort with a large gulp of coffee. "It proved highly effective," added. "Over time, any ideas challenging the materialist agenda were dismissed as impractical or utopian, while narratives celebrating technological and commercial advancements were celebrated as inherently good. Critical thinking was not eradicated, but its focus was narrowed to fit within the boundaries acceptable, and toward the empowerment of any wealthy elites.
After mulling over this revelation, I acknowledged. Critical thinkers were probably just happy to have something to think about, even if the boundaries were narrow. This quip elicited a short, almost amused set of snorts from across the table. I laughed a bit louder, more to hear a somewhat normal laugh, and continued, "But narrowed how?" I felt I understood the game they were describing, but the shifting boundaries of this game were still left underdescribed. What were these boundaries exactly? What kind of intellectual constraints were these material elites setting?
They fostered a form of intellectualism that was compatible with their materialistic world-view,
Pffft, declared. I stared as if this did not fully address my question. Then they elaborated.
This engineered a paradigm where rationality and logic were repurposed. Decisions and policies were no longer about what was culturally or emotionally appropriate or relevant, but focused instead on what could be logically justified within a materialistic framework. The alliance between material and intellectual elites promised a harmonious union of reason with material progress. Those were the boundaries. The rule was clear. Think if you must, but it must rationalize material progress.
The last gulp of coffee had receded from a lingering taste to a sense of dryness. Still, before taking another sip, I asked, "And you mentioned that this strategy eventually backfired?"
"Indeed,"
they affirmed.
"This myopic focus ultimately undermined the very foundation it relied on. As education and critical thinking atrophied, so did society's ability to innovate and to tackle complex challenges. Meanwhile, the societal complexity required to keep enriching the materialist elites increased. Thus, an increasingly complex society faced increasingly complex problems that were unresolvable given the atrophied innovation skills of intellectuals. Eventually, this intellectual stagnation precipitated crises that could no longer be addressed purely through material solutions, at least not with only the material means provided by a single planet."
They paused there a moment, then,
"Unable to sustain the level of innovation required to maintain their dominance and expand their wealth on this limited, complex planet, the stage was set for a new war. One not over land or resources, but over the essence of human thought and the freedom to innovate, a battle for the soul of an earthbound human civilization."
"The stakes were beyond ideological dominance," I ventured.
"Correct,"
they responded swiftly.
"The real battle was over whether society could continue to expand its material wealth infinitely, while bounded by the limits imposed by our relationship with the Earth, or if humanity would need to accept a more sustainable way of living within those boundaries. Those who wanted expansion began to ask, how can we weaken the bond between humanity and Earth? How do we get humanity to let go of its local attachments and embrace a vision of endless material growth beyond Earth? Achieving ideological dominance might not be enough to accomplish this aim, for all Earth's ideologies are rooted in this bond. Therefore, to weaken this bond, all ideologies developed from across this planet had to be weakened."
Their words left me with a chilling realization of the delicate balance between material progress and intellectual freedom. I took another sip of my coffee and asked, "By this point, are there any nations or cultures not yet overtaken by a materialist elite?"
"No. At this point, there are none. Material elites have become global leaders.
Having reshaped Earth's societies, they sought to extend their influence beyond the planet. Pffft, said simply. They envisioned a new frontier for expansion and resource extraction on a currently unimaginable scale, an infinitely expanding scale. So they sought to access the assumedly limitless riches of an infinitely expanding universe. They began pushing for space travel, I asked. Not yet, but you understand. True space travel did not develop until after the Great War of Acceptance. It could not develop until after the Great Acceptance was complete and global, they replied. Then what happened when society faced problems too complex for their atrophied critical thinking? The global material elites enlisted the aid of the arts and humanities. Proposing to loosen up the limits, they proposed an expansion of the boundaries of human knowledge and civilization. They already had the sciences near exclusively working on technology. I frowned, trying to reconcile the nobility of exploration with the greed it masked. And their plan? They needed humanity to adopt an ideology that justified and facilitated this expansion. An ideology that could accept the material elite's right to harvest the universe. That begins with the right to harvest the earth. That's ambitious, I admitted. How could the arts and humanities play a role in all this? Pffft's lips curled into a near smile. The elites, remember, had been funding academia. A very modest grant, awarded to a philosopher, only a few $1,000s of your U.S. currency today, had produced a startling discovery. While they initially used brute force, intimidation, and hijacked rationality to control societies, they realized that there was a subtler and more effective method to subjugate entire cultures: weaponizing acceptance. If acceptance was twisted into an extreme and unwavering virtue, it could serve two purposes. First, to pacify people, and second, to weaken any ideology that tied any human culture to their spot on Earth. I think I get it. By making acceptance a weapon, the first goal of pacification is achieved because, well, questioning anything would violate this new moral standard. Correct, Pffft said, and it worked well for that aim. I imagined the mechanics of this ideological weapon aloud. If everyone is conditioned to believe that the highest virtue is to accept all things without question, then dissent, which is a part of healthy discourse, becomes a vice. Those who challenge the status quo are labeled unaccepting or intolerant and ostracized. Not just ostracized, Pffft interjected. They are denied the material means of survival. Anyone labeled intolerant was not given work or wages. In a civilization where survival depends entirely on turning one's labor into wages to access material resources like food and shelter, this is essentially a death sentence. As the interjection ended, I noticed my cup was empty. And the second aim, I asked, how does a weaponized acceptance dilute all the diverse ideologies developed by past human cultures, enough to sever humanity's ties to their homeland? Pfft had an answer ready on their tongue. The second aim was achieved through their investment in the industries of thought, to cultivate thinkers who would advocate for a universal human culture and morality, one system for all. Humanity began to see itself, not as a collection of diverse societies with distinct needs and beliefs, but as a single entity with all the same needs, the same beliefs, and all in all a singular purpose. While talking, Pfft head had been slowly turning toward the coffee shop's front window, in the same peculiarly mechanical fashion as I'd noticed when I arrived. By the last dependent clause of their remarks, their head had completed the journey. Pffft's eyes were now looking outside. I followed their gaze. A relentless gust of wind battered a cluster of overlapping posters on a telephone pole. They were flapping violently. Each sheet was a riot of color and urgency. Their messages blurred into a frenetic dance that seemed desperate in its attempt to be seen, to be read. Inside, the coffee shop remained a sanctuary of introspection and quiet discourse. My brain struggled to reconcile visual and auditory phenomena of the two scenes, broke the spell, and continued. To fortify control, they promoted a way of thinking, where any decision could be justified by material gains. Nothing was culturally or morally unacceptable anymore, as long as it could be rationalized materially, especially as material progress. I sat back as the words settled against my eardrums. When the pressure receded, I let slip a leading question, aimed at reaching a silly remark. Did the elites name this military operation? No, not that I am aware of. They replied unamusedly. Let's give it a military name then, I said. How about we call it Operation Embrace and Erase? I laughed, but they did not, although the silly remark did not seem to diminish their interest in conversing with me. To keep this interest intact, I decided to ask a serious question. Okay, so in Operation Embrace and Erase, I couldn't resist using the name. The real conflict wasn't between different societies, but within each one, struggling between the drive for material wealth and the need to preserve its own intellectual and cultural depth. That is an adequate description, affirmed, their tone somber yet enlightening. It was a war with two intangible fronts, internal and external. Internally, societies found themselves struggling to reconcile the pursuit of material progress with the maintenance of intellectual integrity and cultural identity. Externally, the challenge was to resist a homogenizing doctrine that threatened to wash away the rich diversity of global cultures under the guise of universal acceptance. This operation, I began reviewing their explanation, targeted the very core of what it means to be a human civilization. Societies battled external forces like wars of old, but this external attack aimed at what? Beliefs instead of grain towers? Cultural cornerstones instead of the stone foundations of turrets? Nodded. Yes, you are close. The weak point of any cultural cornerstone is its inherent and unresolvable contradictions. Those are the targets. I raised an eyebrow, now feeling well outside of my earthbound and natural scientific expertise. Still, to be a contributing conversationalist, I sought an example and said, like, don't kill your neighbor, but killing a neighbor who is more than a few 100 kilometers away, say, in another nation, is just fine. Expanded on my thoughts. Or consider the value of freedom in democratic societies, juxtaposed with the imposition of laws that limit certain freedoms for the sake of order. Another example is the reverence for tradition in some cultures that conflict with human rights, like gender-based inheritance norms, or the tension between parental disciplinary traditions and children's rights. Good examples, I thought, then aloud. But why would attacking contradictions in cultures make any progress in such a war? With a tone of caffeinated understanding, they declared, These contradictions can only be wrestled with, never fully resolved. They are the essence of human complexity, and they are burdensome." There was a pause, presumably for effect. "What if the Great War of Acceptance offers to release you from this challenge? It offers the Great Acceptance. By giving up these contradictions, societies essentially give up the challenge of being unresolvably human at a local and personal scale." "What a solace!" I exclaimed. "Although I know little of social science in a formal sense, it does seem to me that every culture most effectively criticizes another by pointing to these contradictions. Patching and improving upon these contradictory cracks must be exhausting and seemingly unproductive. After all, what outsider can ever be placated with such cultural crack-filling? The offer to ignore these contradictions, the offer to embrace and erase, must have had enormous appeal." "The appeal was indeed enormous," they stated like a soothsayer. "It offers the opportunity to be something, like Irish or Islamic, without the burden of grappling with these identities' deepest mysteries. When a culture ignores their contradictions, these cracks grow, and a culture's foundations crumble. If they crumble enough, they will be lost entirely. Then there is no foundation stone fit to rebuild a rich culture upon." The allure of an easy resolution to deep-seated cultural contradictions, what many cultures might call their mysteries, was undeniable. Yet it seemed like a Faustian bargain, and I spoke while weighing it. Everyone in any culture gets the opportunity to escape the constant struggle with their inherent contradictions. In exchange, one gets a shallow and easily worn cultural veneer, and a deceptively appealing sense of unity and peace. Pffft seized the thread of my thoughts before they could unravel further. "And casualties of this kind of war are not measured in physical deaths, but in cultural acceptances, cultural surrenders. Each culture, once having accepted enough exceptions to the way of their life, results in what you might call a peace, in fact, not in appearance." I considered this idea and said, "But each culture can be accepting while maintaining the diverse array of human expression, the language, rites of passage, cuisines, and rituals that connected them to their spot on the earth and to each other. It seems like you're suggesting that these all began to fade. What did this fading look like exactly?" "Pfft," answered pedantically, as if explaining a simple geometric theorem. "Language and cuisine and so on, yes, all remained, but they remained only in material form. Take cuisine, for instance. Everyone ate whatever culture's cuisine they wanted, when they wanted it, when they could afford it. The streets became a line of diverse cuisine options for purchase, not for cultural sake. Every street had one restaurant of every culture. Individuals found themselves adrift in a sea of sameness that looked like a sea of diversity." Having myself seen many streets like this today, I had no difficulty imagining. "But who won the war, then?" "The ideology of acceptance reigned supreme. It is the one and only guiding principle of our future," Pffft replied with a solemnity that matched the heavy silence that followed. "That's tragic," was my immediate opinion. "What about the vibrant diversity of cultures that once populated Earth? The myriad ways in which humans express their love, and grief, joy, and curiosity?" Pfft replied with their uniquely subtle condescension. "Such diversity, while previously seen as enriching, as quaint romances with a place, became seen as an impediment. The harmonization of interests and goals was deemed essential." "But why?" I pressed, feeling a mix of disbelief and despair. Why was it deemed necessary to suppress local passions, cultures, and individualities, to dilute the essence of what makes each culture, each society unique?
Pffft,
Responded as if stating the obvious.
for the sake of a larger dream. This ambition was grand, intergalactic. Consider, if every person, every society clung to their local cultures and traditions, how could Earth have ever mustered the unified front required to venture beyond its skies, to engage in intergalactic explorations and become part of the larger cosmic community? A planet cannot be fractured by diverse and often divergent interests, full of inherent contradictions. What you call cultures, especially not by those rooted deeply in local attachments. All resources from all people, or at least almost all, must be mustered toward the single purpose.
I did consider this for a moment, then talked out the theory as I saw it. If one is aware of the beauty of their local attachments, their traditions, the rhythms of their lands, the familiar cadences of their dialects, then in your theory these provide such a deep-seated sense of contentment and identity that the very thought of going elsewhere becomes silly, unnecessary. Nodded like their neck was a mechanical spring, and as the spring-like motion dampened, they clarified this theory. Perhaps it was official IBS doctrine.
For many across the galaxies, true contentment is found in the intricate details of the local, in the dance of the trees or grasses of their land, the age-old recipes passed down generations, the stories whispered by those too aged to wander, and the general joy of being rooted in a singular time and place. This kind of extremely physically constrained contentment fosters a sentiment where the thought of something better out there is an alien notion. They find their better right where they stand, wrapped in the fabric of their locality and history. Humanity ensnared in this kind of contentment is too small to think or act at any large scale.
Detecting a touch more condescension in Pffff's voice than before, I pressed on to test their perspective further. Because in such a state a community of humans is useful to each other, but useless beyond? For why would anyone yearn to traverse the stars, or even cross over to the next town?
Precisely, they responded. In such a condition, any travel beyond the boundaries of the known and loved, even a simple journey to a neighboring settlement, suggests an element of discontent or dislocation. Either external forces compel them, or an internal void prompts them. For when one is truly rooted, the heart feels no urge to wander.
Their statement hung in the air as we both, I assume, contemplated a universe where cultures lost their rootedness, and the consequences that followed. I put my empty cup to my lips and softly mumbled, "So, we traded our soul for the stars." My companion reacted.
Humanity traded a small earthbound existence. No, smaller than that. A place-bound existence of universal insignificance for a grand one. After unification through acceptance, humanity rapidly rose to become one of the most industrious species in the universe. We were no longer wed to the laws of Earth, but could live within the infinitely varied laws of the universe.
A realization struck me. Of course, Pffft would hold this accomplishment in high regard. They were an intergalactic naturalist, after all, if they weren't insane and their story was to be believed. An amazing future, no doubt, I replied, hoping to keep my companion in a sharing mood. Despite my different opinion on the current matter, I enjoyed hearing their stories. Moreover, I appreciated the act of pretending these stories were real, immersing myself in the notion that I might be gaining insight into the mindset of some future humanity. Assuming humanity became an interstellar phenom, perhaps otherworldly life forms would decide to pester us. I shared this thought, saying, "Was the start of this universe-scale humanity challenging? Even with mostly every human on board, working toward this end, surely there were problems. Noteworthy ones. Maybe even problems that directly concerned the IBS, global ecology, or the burgeoning field of intergalactic naturalists." Perked up in a way that seemed like it would have happened even without the recent caffeine. "A fascinating time for the field indeed." Then they looked at their empty cup and the door. They said, "I would like to tell you one of these stories next week." The suddenness of the conversation concluding statement was not all that surprising. Was somewhat sudden in nearly every interaction. I was excited that they were interested in another coffee chat. "Yes," I said somewhat more loudly than intended. Then, at a normal volume, I added, "I suppose we're out of time today." "Correct. Thank you for the caffeine." Stood up abruptly, gave me a brief nod before heading toward the door. As they exited, a gust of wind caught the door and flung it shut behind them. I realized that I'd been left alone with the colorful mess of posters. Puzzled about what exactly to do with them, I began gathering them into a stack. As I did, I noticed a group of activist-type students eyeing me suspiciously. Their expressions suggested they recognized at least some of the posters I was collecting. Approaching them with the stack, I offered a sheepish smile and said, "Please pardon my friend for pulling these down. They are an academic, you know, studying a related subject." After an awkward pause, I concluded with, "They asked me to return these to you. If they're yours." The students exchanged glances before one of them motioned for me to put the posters on the table. With a nod of thanks, I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, the door closing softly behind me as I left the scene of another peculiar encounter with... Chapter 3. Humanity Back on the Menu. Before Lovecraft, William Hope Hodgson was already writing Nightmares from the Deep. Quote,
"I am suddenly awakened by men's voices, shrieking, cursing, praying. At times, broken off short with that hellishly suggestive glut, glut. That is the unearthly bellowing of the thing. Fear incarnate seizes me, and I can only fall on my knees and pray. Too well I know what is happening."
End quote. The next coffee chat day dawned with one of those beautifully paradoxical mornings, cloudy yet warm and dry. It was perfect for a long bike ride across town. One could put aside any sunburn concerns and look forward to the kind of slight chill breeze that only cycling speeds along slow roadways can conjure. Since last week's conversation with Pffffft, my thoughts often turned to my bond with the earth, particularly toward a newfound or revived kinship with my immediate surroundings. Inspired, I resurrected my neglected bike from its grave in some forgotten back corner of the garage, tuned its gears, recharged its USB lights, and embraced a new cycling ritual. It felt like a small defense against the ominous future Pffft had hinted at. Within days, my daily rides transformed into a near-sacred ritual of local worship. Pedaling the streets without the steely shield of an automobile was comprehensively connective, an embrace of the landscape in a way no car could replicate. It was a trust exercise with both nature's whims and the unpredictable attentiveness of my community, at least its motorists. Each successful arrival at work felt lucky and permitted, some days even sanctioned by the landscape and community. Then each ride home deepened my sense of belonging to this small corner of the world. Sure, any homecoming felt heartwarming to some degree, but returning home on the bike saddle produced an additional touch of heartwarmth, perhaps from the spark of having risked a little more to stay connected. Today's route was straightforward, a clear path primarily along lightly trafficked roads, under speed limits that encouraged a comfortable balance of caution and contemplation. Yet something about the clouds, lower than usual, almost too still, nudged at the edges of my thoughts, a faint, irrational unease. The occasional bridge offered views of meandering streams and drew me fully into the moment. Still, my side view mirror caught fleeting, expressionless glances from passing vehicular commuters, rare smiles behind tinted glass flickering so briefly I sometimes questioned their reality. Perhaps it was just my optimism, painting illusory smiles on hurried faces. Even the happiest cyclist knows that the road would profit from a little more positivity. Once I reached the long stretch of protected bike lane, my senses relaxed slightly, allowing me to admire the scenery with a little less caution. My gaze was drawn more to the asphalt than to the city skyline or the meandering streams at the base of the hilltops that bore my road. Midway through spring, the roadside had become a grim tableau of new life abruptly ended. Roadkill. Freshly emerged toads lay flattened, their fragile bodies pressed into the asphalt. Battered birds broken against speeding windshields lay twitching unnaturally in the gusts from passing vehicles. Even larger predators transformed into beloved neighborhood pets were not spared. A few cats and a solitary dog lay sprawled in the no-man's land between the proper roadway and the bike lane. As I neared the coffee shop, the environment shifted palpably. Familiar landscapes and bustling streets interrupted my reflective journey on spring roadkill. While locking my bike to a parking meter and making preparations to move toward the cafe, my thoughts drifted to predatory birds. It struck me that, despite humanity's pervasive presence, these creatures, even in their most desperate hunger, rarely challenged us, or even more surprising, our children. Despite us being mostly oblivious to the vast expanse above us. Our dominance is absolute. Even the sky was not the limit. What a stark contrast to the lifeless forms of smaller creatures that lay scattered by the roadside. I entered the familiar cafe and approached the familiar barista, surveying the room all the while. My companion had not yet arrived. The room hummed with quiet industry. Ordering the largest carafe of pour-over coffee they offered with 2 mugs, I settled into an open table near the window to wait. There's a certain comfort in being the first to arrive, the freedom to choose the seat, the relief of ordering without the awkwardness of small talk in front of a busy barista. The first arriver can settle in and listen to the brum-brum-brum of the grinder as it promises a caffeinated embrace. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted Pffffft ambling along the sidewalk. More clouds had gathered since I last checked the sky, and their steps carried a curious stealth. Indeed, their odd walk-like maneuvering upon over-inspection blended into the urban backdrop like a prey animal evading an unseen predator. Pffft's cautious approach, frequently glancing at the sky and deliberate testing of the door handle, seemed practiced to the point of casual routine. Their entrance was cautious, their eyes scanning the room with meticulous precision, mapping the innumerable possibilities that might emerge from each chair and table. I had not known them long, but I realized that this was their usual way. Their peculiar movements had always been a tad fluid yet calculated when I looked back. It bore the mark of lifelong training turned habit, deliberate everyday acts of survival. They sat down with an almost imperceptible sigh of relief, their eyes still darting occasionally, ever watchful. "Well, that was an entrance," I remarked, trying to lighten the mood. Pfft nodded, their expression serious. "One can never be too careful," they said, their voice low. "What a vessel of covfefe! Thanks for setting the table while waiting for me. Shall we begin?" "Absolutely," I replied as I began pouring the coffee. "Today's brew is from Ethiopia. grown high up in their mountains. Before going on, I looked up at my companion, who seemed as unimpressed with my introduction of the estate as they were ignorant of its geographic context. Remembering their confessed ignorance of Earth, I asked, "Do you know much of the biogeography of coffee?"
"Nothing,"
replied.
"I assume you are asking about Earth specifically."
Since this question ended in a kind of silent look that suggested it was not rhetorical, I nodded. They continued with the faintest trace of condescension.
"I am no expert on the natural systems of this planet. I have no notion of the nation you mentioned, nor what its geography has to do with coffee."
Then sipped the coffee before them, saying,
"This lack of knowledge does not diminish my enjoyment in any way. Thank you."
"Well," I ventured, "Ethiopia is quite far away. These beans have crossed not only an ocean, but a hemisphere." Pffft's pupils dilated slightly.
"To transport something from so far? Are you not concerned here in your times about accidentally bringing dangerous life forms from one place to another? Do you not worry about the possibility of a destructive invasion?"
They paused reflectively, then said,
"This will become a great concern of intergalactic naturalists."
"Oh, absolutely," I answered. "There have been some disasters in some places from some plant or animal accidentally being carried across an ocean. Like kudzu, a vine that led a nicely balanced life in its native soils, has covered entire forests south of here, where it is essentially an alien invader." Leaned forward.
"This is the way of exploration. There is a saying from another intergalactic species about discoveries, that they have two shadows, one cast by the light of stars, another by the void of ignorance. That second shadow is a void indeed. You speak of discoveries across mere earthly oceans and their catastrophic impacts. If an earthbound ignorance casts such shadows, imagine what horrors might arise from humanity's intergalactic explorations."
Attention drifted just beyond the room. Outside toward the brewing storm, I followed their gaze and noticed how the world had darkened dramatically. My bike seat was going to get wet. I pushed this concern aside, focusing instead on their cryptic remark. "No, I don't think I can imagine it," I said finally. "Today on Earth we have ships and planes and trucks, all cozy vessels for possible stowaways like seeds or insects. And even outside these vessels the conditions may be harsh, but only harsh in familiar forms: wind, water, sunlight, and so on. Elements that life here already relies on. Space, though, is an entirely different thing, isn't it? Wouldn't the vacuum of space sanitize spaceships of any external hitchhikers from other planets, or galaxies for that matter? Could anything even hold on at space-traveling speeds?"
"It is clear,"
began,
"that you know nothing about space travel."
After a pause, they added with measured gravity,
"The universe is not as barren as you think. There are more niches beyond Earth's, and the organisms that fill such niches have challenged humans' fundamental concepts of life and reality."
I became aware of how dimly lit this coffee shop was. What was typically a cozy atmosphere now felt a bit unsettling. Somehow the roots of that familiar warmth had begun conspiring with the clouds to burrow into darker, uninvited corners of my psyche, stirring unease in places best left undisturbed. I was inwardly contemplating these dark corners when voice pulled me back to the conversation.
"When humanity first ventured into the vastness of space, they thought themselves prepared to encounter life beyond their Earth-centered comprehension. But they underestimated just how limited their grasp on reality truly was. Reality is vast, What humans hold of it is but a small handle on an immense and perilous apparatus."
"What?" I asked, incredulous. "Even with our telescopes and satellites? More advanced, I assume, in the future. Early intergalactic humanity weren't, or won't be prepared for the coming hazards of discovery?"
"Correct."
Took a slow, deliberate sip of their warm Ethiopian elixir before elaborating.
"Early intergalactic naturalists, many pioneers of the field, faced new life forms not only physically dangerous in ways previously unimaginable by Earth standards, but they faced organisms that defied every attempt at physical definition, quantification, or categorization."
"Wait," I interrupted. "They discovered non-physical entities?"
"No,"
they replied in a tone of someone who was naively interrupted.
"These organisms were entirely physical, but they operated beyond the limits of human physical definitions."
We stared at each other while the first heavy drops of the storm punctuated our silence, tapping against the window. Each impact seemed oddly tactile.
"Do you understand?"
asked, their voice sharp. I nodded, though the uncertainty of my nod betrayed my hesitation. "Honestly, I know many academics, maybe even myself, who might be driven to a degree of madness by indescribable discoveries. How would I publish them?" I laughed at my own joke to invite their laughter. The invitation was not received, so I finished my solo while tilted their head slightly, their expression unreadable.
"Some did go mad,"
they confirmed.
"They began to question their perspectives on reality, their sanity, and even their own physical existence. Others became obsessed, searching for a key to unlock these mysteries, only to discover it also unlocked the fragile tethers that held their minds together."
There was a pause as touched the warm carafe, where less than half a cup of coffee broadly reposed in a dark film. When they touched the glass, patterns shivered across its surface.
"These naturalists began to see patterns where none existed, or worse, failed to see patterns where patterns surely did exist. Their instruments betrayed them, offering readings that defied sense as they understood it. In journals, they report that their own eyes betrayed them, seeing indecipherable forms that melted into one another, beings inhabiting multiple places at once, and so on. Some disappeared entirely, lost to the far reaches of space, or perhaps swallowed by the organisms they sought to study. Those who returned were changed."
"Changed?" I asked, intrigued.
"Fragmented,"
said simply.
"Their thoughts scattered. They spoke in disjointed sentences. Some could no longer bear to look at the stars. Others retreated to dark rooms, muttering about what they weren't sure they'd seen."
Their voice ended in a whispery tone that felt more fitting for a campfire horror story than a coffee chat. I shared the first thought that came to mind. "And their findings," I pressed. "Surely they recorded something. Data? Notes? Preliminary results?"
"Those who tried left behind only incoherence,"
replied.
"Their notes were riddled with symbols and diagrams that made no sense. They hurt the eyes to look at. The more they tried to explain what they had seen, the more their writing devolved into what appeared to be a jumble of madness."
"Like your dates," I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. They smirked, pulled out their pen, looked around guardedly, and scribbled on a nearby napkin some symbols. I couldn't tell if they were joking or serious, but I took the napkin anyway. Picking up my cup, I asked, "What happened to them?" My breath passed over the steam of my coffee.
Some took their own lives. Others sank into alleys and gutters of Earth or other planets. One, in despair, stole a spacecraft and parked it in the innermost orbit of a supermassive black hole. The ship and its pilot were torn apart, their remains scattered across the event horizon. Some say fragments of the pilot's mind were scattered across time and space, eternally echoing back in ghostly signals that no one dares decode.
The rain was really at it now. Its relentless drumming against the windows obscured the typical coffee shop soundscape. I imagined that the rainy rhythms were tapping out the ghostly signals of that lost pioneer of intergalactic natural science. A glance out the window confirmed that the storm had intensified. Sheets of rain now lashed against the glass. The world beyond the cafe was now a shifting blur of motion and shadow, the storm lending an almost sentient presence to the moment. Stories seemed to have drawn the darkness closer, as if the boundaries between here and somewhere else, between this moment and its future, were thinning. I looked back to my companion who sat breathing into their coffee cup as steam curled before their steady eyes. They remained mostly unaffected by the cosmic horrors they described, like a parent reading a cautionary tale to a child. I cleared my throat and ventured, "But here you are, an intergalactic naturalist who speaks coherently, well, at least mostly coherently. How does the field go from pioneers who blaze trails into madness to, well, professionals like yourself and other agents of the IBS?" Eyes subtly shifted in a way that suggested they were considering the question's worth.
These findings were only madness to those unwilling or unable to expand their perspective of reality. Every new intergalactic species must endure the substantial mental pains of discarding most of their foundational understanding. I, and other agents of the IBS, have managed to accomplish this. We have embraced this transformation.
I leaned back, my thoughts swirling with the storm outside. The cafe felt less like a refuge and more like a cocoon of shadows that muted the senses, perfectly suited to test the boundaries of sanity. I couldn't resist asking, "I can't help wondering, even at my own psychological peril, could you give me an example of a niche-defying organism, something that was inexplicable?" Did not hesitate.
There was one. It occupied every niche. We observed it functioning as a primary producer, converting raw energy into life-sustaining forms, only to find that same organism later acting as a parasite, drawing life from another host. It could be a predator one moment, preying on other organisms, and the next, it might be the prey, shifting between roles without any predictable pattern. It consumed or nourished as it willed.
I searched for an earthly analogy. That's reminiscent of fungi. They can kill, nourish, coexist symbiotically or parasitically.
Indeed,
they said, but their expression darkened.
I have spared you from an incomprehensible discovery. Imagine something else. An organism that doesn't need the trickery of niche mobility, but is simply an exceptional predator, suited to the behaviors of human prey, accidentally being introduced to Earth.
I thought, shook momentarily, like a deer recalling for a moment that they are deer. Their eyes flicked to the window, then back to me. The rain lashed harder as if marking an unseen presence that neither of us dared acknowledge. I refilled my coffee, feeling the transfer of warmth from the carafe to my cup, a brief comfort. "There's a whole movie on something like this from a few decades ago," I said, trying to interject a light-hearted note. "I suppose this would be a technologically advanced organism, seeking conquest or cattle." Pffft shook their head with an unchanging expression.
"No, this organism needed no technology. In fact, humanity's technology, your rigid dwellings and unnatural geometries attracted its attention. Boxy walls, predictable layouts, these became invitations."
"So our homes and business buildings were like clamshells to it," I interjected, attempting a chuckle. "Like an otter breaking into dinner, except we were the dinner."
"Indeed,"
my companion replied.
"to reach the defenseless humans inside."
My chuckling subsided during that remark. Then, leaning forward, I asked, "But surely if technology attracted it, there would be other technology, say a gun, that could destroy the creature?" Lips pressed into something resembling a thin, straight line.
"A gunshot cannot kill a viral particle or bacterial contagion. Neither could it kill the Glyptodices."
The strange name seemed to trip on the air in its voyage from their lips to my comprehension. It truly seemed like sound from a different time. Glyptodices, Deutsches? I trailed off, tripping over the syllables. Did not appear to be listening to my attempt to pronounce this name. They continued.
"It is both microscopic and macroscopic. Individually, it is microbial in size. Communally, it is visible, vaporous, foamy, in a way, and deliberate. The individual microbe-scale life forms coalesce to consume prey."
An alien slime mold, I murmured. "Well, if it's microbial, then a different technology could kill it or deter it. A vaccine, an antibiotic, a fungicidal treatment to one's home or clothes, or some other sort of cidal treatment, a glypalcide?"
"Incorrect,"
was their response, laced with that peculiarly subtle condescension of theirs. I got the impression that was labeling both my idea and my pronunciation of the organism with this word.
"Human medical technologies. Vaccinations, antibiotics, fungicides. None could deter or destroy it. Even in my time, humanity has found no cure, no deterrent, no weapon to kill it. It and its attacks were distinct."
They stopped at that word and sipped coffee as if that was all there was to be said about it. So I asked, "Distinct? How? Please do go on." Seemed to hesitate. In fact, they looked slightly surprised, colored slightly, and even leaned in ever so slightly before saying,
"It coalesces like a foaming mist, glistening and wet, maneuvering deliberately through the air. Sometimes bubbles are suspended in its form, pinkish, almost luminous, sheened in the fluids of its last victim, human or pet. When it turns abruptly in pursuit of prey, these bubbles will suddenly flick large droplets of this fluid, or burst, flinging the sound of wet footsteps trickling behind itself. The faint popping of its eddies as it approaches becomes a noise that all ears soon keep wary of."
A chill traced my spine, well warmed and caffeinated as it was. The storm outside seemed to crescendo in time with their words. My ears tuned into the distorted symphony of that cafe. The gusts of wind hammering the windows rose and fell in and out of sync with the low grind of the espresso machine and the shrill hiss of steamers frothing milk. Was this like the sound of the stalking interstellar predator? My companion had gotten into my head. These comforting noises turned dissonant and alien. The shrieking bursts of air against metal now sounded like drowning screams, muffled and trapped within a thick, unrelenting primordial fluid. A living substance, quivering with the weight of the lives it had consumed, bubbling as if on the verge of bursting, yet seething violently at any hint of escape. "How horrifying," I whispered, staring at my near-empty cup. "So what does humanity do? Do we still live on Earth in your time?" Gaze steadied on mine.
Humanity learned to live as both predator and prey, they said simply. Your cities, those rigid grids of concrete and glass, were evacuated, left to be overrun by the natural world. Humanity retreated into dwellings designed to mimic nature. Hidden and irregular, these structures were more difficult for the Glyptolystes to recognize. Most were built just below ground, blending seamlessly into the environment.
"Like hobbits," I muttered. Tilted their head.
"Whatever those are. Humanity left rivers to meander. No more dams were built. Forests were allowed to grow wild. Trees were planted not for shade, but for safety, their canopies shielding us from aerial predators and their roots obscuring the entryways to our homes. Humanity of the future became part of the environment again, blending into it. This is not unique to our species. Across the cosmos, the balance between predator and prey shapes survival. Our human ancestors lived this way once, without all the technologies you have today. And make no mistake, we had more in the future. Still, the Glyptolystes left humanity no choice but to return to a natural dwelling, or be consumed."
I swallowed dryly, forgetting to sip my coffee while trying to picture this future Earth. "What about space?" I asked, finding my voice. "Surely humanity didn't give up its explorations?"
"No," they replied. "Even among the stars, humanity learned to survive as both predator and prey. Our ships mimic asteroids, their reflective surfaces abandoned for camouflage. Space stations hide within planetary rings or deep craters of shadowed moons."
"And the organism, the Glyptolystes?" I asked, stumbling over the name. "Didn't the IBS intervene?" Regarded me for a moment, their expression softening to something almost like pity.
Earth did not require intervention. No organism or system was in danger of extinction. The Glyptolystes became the apex predator, just as they have done on a few other planets, and just as humanity became the apex predator of many new continents on Earth.
"But surely humanity must have asked for help." Leaned back slightly, returning to a near-perfect right-angle posture in relation to the table. Matter-of-factly, they said,
"The IBS does not accept requests for intervention. If they did, the requests would be endless, and just as endlessly destructive. Would you have wished them to save continents on this planet from the invasive humans?"
I fell silent, their questions settling any debate I felt I could honestly begin. Outside, the rain had reduced to a drizzle, faint streaks trickling down the glass. Drained the last of their coffee and stood, as abruptly as they do everything else.
"This weather," they said, "is ideal for migrating from one indoor location to another. I will take this opportunity to do so."
"It is still raining, but it will probably be sunny soon," I said, hinting that the impending weather would probably be better suited to walking than the current drizzle. Heard me, but continued their abrupt departing procedures, saying on their cautious way to the door,
"Thank you again for the Ethiopian bean juice. I would stay with you until the sun is shining, but that is not ideal for my purpose. We must take care so that we can caffeinate again next week."
I watched them leave, their movements fluid and deliberate. For a moment I considered following, but instead, I flagged the barista for another coffee and a croissant. I would wait for the sun to dry the roads and my bike seat, wondering meanwhile if humanity's true predator was not any particular organism, but the arrogance that led us to believe we had none. Thus, for now, I would sit, the storm's remnants tapping gently against the windows, and keep an eye on the faint mist outside. Surely it wasn't moving. Surely. Chapter 4. The Twin Earth Experiment. Philosopher Hilary Putnam once kicked off a thought experiment with a little interplanetary mischief. Quote, "Suppose that somewhere there is a planet we shall call Twin Earth. Twin Earth is very much like Earth. In fact, apart from the differences we shall specify in our science fiction, the reader may suppose that Twin Earth is exactly like Earth. He may even suppose that he has an identical copy on Twin Earth if he wishes, although my stories will not depend on this." End quote. When the day arrived for my fourth coffee chat with the supercilious Pffffft, I had almost forgotten about it. Thank you, cell phone reminders. The university system was in a stir. Artificial intelligence had suddenly become easily and affordably accessible, and faculty and students were using it. Naturally, this meant something had to be done. Scientists and students are only meant to be resourceful within the narrowly approved parameters of university regulations and procedures. And yet here they were, daring to think with an unauthorized tool. A clarion call was sounded, and a mandatory faculty meeting was set for the very morning of my weekly coffee chat. After a foggy bike ride, I sat into another fog, a panel on large language models and ethics in science education. The meeting seemed precisely calibrated to enhance one's craving for stimulants if they valued consciousness. By the second slide, it became clear that we were all stuck in a rhetorical traffic jam. Various grim billboards along this traffic jam, PowerPoint slides with bold apocalyptic titles, read, "The algorithm doesn't care, do we?" Or, "Guardrails or gates, can we contain the machine?" And, "LLMs, the death of original thought?" One professor sighed dramatically before declaring, "The machine doesn't create, it reflects, and what it reflects is us. What does that say about us?" Heads nodded solemnly. Pens scratched dutifully. Laptop keys clicked and clacked. I yawned discreetly, forcing my eyes not to squint as they watered. The debate circled the same dire warnings: plagiarism, dependency, the erosion of critical thinking. "AI will dull intellectual rigor," one attendee declared, apparently believing that such rigor was currently thriving. My thoughts began to drift. Surely this tool was not the doom of education or science. If anything, it was more like what a previous outburst suggested, a mirror, reflecting our own thinking and biases, helping us to ask better questions. Couldn't machines sharpen our thinking, challenging lazy assumptions with their growing capacity to compute, critique, and even mimic creativity? I struggled to imagine AI dulling thought in our current academic system, where no paper is truly reviewed, and yet every paper is somehow published. If anything, AI might reinvigorate intellectual rigor, certainly more effectively than our existing methods, whatever those may be. As the panel neared its dreary conclusion, a pessimistic ethical framework began to take its official form. A senior faculty member stood to summarize, their tone grave yet triumphant. Students and faculty must understand that while AI tools are permitted, such use must not produce any undue ease, efficiency, or convenience. Learning must remain arduous, painstaking, and immune to shortcuts. AI may be employed, but only if it preserves the noble struggle that has defined education and discovery for centuries. A student, and scientist too, must emerge from their work not merely with new knowledge, but with the character-building exhaustion that proves their worth. Perhaps this is how I heard it more than how it was stated. Regardless, that was essentially the decree. Machines may assist but never relieve. Scholastic endeavor above all must remain at its core a pain-centered character-building exercise, even as the same education system simultaneously claims to be removing every other possible barrier to learning. These thoughts brought me from the meeting room to the outer door of the building. Outside, a cool breeze, mercifully loaded with fog from the nearby lake, cleared some of the academic fog from my mind. Heavy, low-hanging clouds lingered, but the brisk air lifted my spirits. I walked slowly, mentally unraveling the pessimism of the meeting like tangled threads, trying to reknit them into a more optimistic tapestry. What if we stopped fearing AI as an invasive force, and instead treated it as a curious child, humanity's own brainchild? Rather than stoking fear in students, the academic offices tasked with nurturing knowledge could help humanity's brainchild and the next generation of thinkers to coexist authentically. Neglected brainchildren, if they are much like neglected actual children, could grow into troublesome adults. Lost in thought, I almost missed Pffffft standing at the corner just ahead of the coffee shop. They stood perfectly still, postured geometrically as though aligning their body to complement the angles of sunlight filtering through the street trees. The way the light struck their features made them look calibrated. AI flashed to mind again, not as a tool, but as something else more like. "Hello," I called out, approaching. "Waiting for me?" They turned their head sharply and spoke the word "coincidence," as though it were a greeting. "Well, it's good to see you," I said, brushing off my morning thought dust. "You wouldn't believe the meeting I just escaped." Tilted their head, either inviting elaboration or merely acknowledging my escape. It was always hard to tell the intent of their subtler movements. They opened the cafe door with the kind of meticulous care one might reserve for cracking a safe. Inside, the warm scent of coffee embraced us, the quiet hum of conversation and the hiss of steaming milk filling the space. At the counter, an unfamiliar barista greeted us with a cheerful, "Good morning. How are you today?" Stared, unblinking as though the question was a riddle to be solved. "I am going to drink coffee and answer this person's questions about the future," they finally replied, gesturing toward me. Their tone carried no hostility, and yet, somehow it felt profoundly rude. The barista's smile faltered. "Uh-huh," she murmured, clearly deciding it was best not to pursue the conversation. "The future is already here," I offered lightly. "AI's everywhere. Writing, art, math, you name it. Have you had any experience with it yet?" She nodded cautiously. "Oh, definitely. I'm an illustrator on the side. Well, I was. AI's gotten so good now, clients go straight to the programs. Honestly, it's been kind of devastating. Before I could respond sympathetically, interjected with clinical detachment.
Now you have time to create art you value. Instead of art, you were economically pressured into valuing.
She paused mid-reach for something, visibly torn between confusion and irritation. Sure, she said. Her tone clipped, then turned away pointedly, clearly done with the conversation. Oblivious to the awkwardness, began prodding at the biscotti in the jar on the counter, their fingers tapping over 2 sticks as though testing their structural integrity. We'll take those, I said quickly, before the barista intervened. I paid, thanked her, and ushered my strange companion toward a table in the back corner of the shop, before they could engage her further. Moments later, the barista returned with our coffee and biscotti, professional but noticeably cooler. Began arranging the biscotti with ritual precision. I leaned back, letting the first sip of coffee work its magic, trying to clear my mind of the morning's meeting.
Do you know, they began, breaking the silence, that AI will eventually do everyone's thinking?
I choked slightly on my coffee. Everyone's? Even the intergalactic naturalists? I teased. Surely their work, and that of the intergalactic chemists and geologists and physicists, is a bit too nuanced for that.
Certainly not,
they replied, slightly condescendingly.
Scientific thinking is easier for AI than other forms of art.
Because art is in the eye of the beholder. It is subjective, while science is systematic, I ventured.
Incorrect,
said with vague disappointment, as though I'd fumbled an easy exam question.
Beauty is in the eye that can behold it. And the primitive sciences of your time are only systematic simply because you have decided they must be.
Primitive, I echoed. What about global land surface or atmospheric models? Or quantum mechanics? Aren't these a bit beyond the sandbox stage? Exhaled slightly, the closest thing I had seen to a sigh.
Quantum mechanics is children smashing toys together in a sandbox. Most young children smash toy cars, watching pieces fly in all directions, discovering the gears and wheels that blast off. As some of these children age and acquire education, they build larger hands to smash smaller toys at higher velocities to discover what fragments emerge. They will then smash those fragments. It is a recursive endeavor.
I couldn't help but laugh. A rather cynical take. I took another sip of coffee, considering their analogy. Before I could offer a defense, they went on.
And when they tire of smashing, they will turn to AI for answers. The real innovation of your time is not quantum mechanics or your so-called whole Earth simulation models. It's the machines that will eventually surpass the limited imagination of your era's scientists.
The last remark caught me off guard. I wasn't hearing it for the first time, that our scientific ideas had grown stale. Yet my companion spoke as if our era's intellectual stagnation was already a footnote in their history books. I mounted no defense. Instead, I sought to nudge the conversation toward another story from Pffft. Okay, I began. If AI is doing the real thinking in the future, what's something interesting that it was able to think out? Did AI discover how the universe began? That we're living in a simulation? Maybe it found multiple dimensions. At the mention of multiple dimensions, its expression shifted, as if about to deliver a comforting fact from a grade school textbook. I paused to let that expression settle into speech.
We discovered one more dimension, they said simply. That was enough to change the way we viewed ours. Afterwards, we stopped looking.
Stopped looking? I asked. Why? Their fingers tapped against the biscotti once, twice, then stopped as if they'd just calculated something.
Because it was sufficient, they said flatly.
I waited, but they just lifted their coffee and took a deliberate sip. Sufficient for what? I prompted. After setting down their cup with precision, they clarified.
Sufficient to change the way we viewed our reality. After that, there was no need to look further.
I frowned. I don't entirely follow. Certainly if you, or AI, I guess, discovered one extra dimension, that would only spur human scientists to search even more, to see what else might be out there.
This is an error of your time, they quipped with mild amusement. Scientists of this era are unable to recognize when an answer is complete. Your time is obsessed with seeking more, without being able to imagine what enough looks like.
All right, I exhaled slowly. Then tell me, what was this dimension like? How was it discovered? Set down their coffee.
It was discovered, they began, by artificial intelligence.
I nodded as if to say, of course it was, while they continued.
The anomalies were first detected not far from our Earth. Ziggy, the AI responsible, reported strange, minute but persistent disturbances in the fabric of space-time. Its sensors picked up subtle deviations in the local metric, slight fluctuations in curvature, unexpected gravitational lensing effects, and aberrant redshift signatures, suggesting energy discrepancies unaccounted for by standard models. In short, the data hinted at a patch of space behaving as though it possessed an additional dimension. Naturally, the physicists of the time became excited.
I smirked. Excited? I thought you said they were toddlers in a sandbox.
Excited toddlers, corrected. They immediately tasked another AI to analyze the anomalies. When the results were inconclusive, they commissioned yet another AI to examine the possibilities. This AI suggested the most likely explanation: interdimensional travel.
Looking down at my coffee, I muttered more to myself than my companion. So they didn't figure any of it out themselves. They just kept asking the machines for answers.
Precisely, replied immediately. After millions in grant funding, they returned to Ziggy with a new directive: determine how these anomalies might be opened or accessed. Eventually, with further assistance from other AIs, Ziggy devised a method to open what you might call a portal.
I leaned back, trying to wrap my head around the implications. And on the other side of this portal...
Another Earth?
They said that simply, their tone betraying no wonder.
An Earth that was almost identical to ours.
Almost? I wondered aloud. While I wondered, my companion finally took a bite of a biscotti, a large one. Then while chewing, they contributed more information.
This other Earth was shocked to see our dimensions, Earthlings. They had always believed they could not be disturbed. After all, they were the Control Earth.
My coffee cup hovered midair. The Control Earth?
Yes, said. It was quickly revealed that our Earth, the one you inhabit now and where I will be born, is the experimental version. They call our Earth the Can-Do, Will-Do Earth, CDWD for short. Meanwhile, the Control Earth has remained pristine, untouched by our dimension's recklessness.
I set my cup down, my mind spinning a little. So, what does that mean? What kind of experiments?
All kinds,
my companion replied.
Every technological advancement, every economic system, every form of governance. Our Earth has been a testing ground for ideas. Successful experiments inform the decisions of the control Earth. Disastrous ones were carefully avoided.
I stared at them while processing the enormity of this claim. We're guinea pigs.
Guinea pigs implies an element of care,
they replied with a curious head tilt.
Our Earth is more like a sandbox for trial and error.
I repeated what they said. A sandbox for trial and error. Huh. How long have we been experimented on? Adjusted their coffee cup as if fine-tuning its position.
The control Earth, what one might call the prudent Earth, has been manipulating your world since long before our species understood the wheel. But it is not time alone that defines the experiment. It is scale. The CDWD Earth's reckless ambition has always been its defining trait and its utility.
Reckless ambition, I asked, grimacing a little. Do you mean humanity's drive to innovate?
Drive to innovate, drive to destroy. It is the same force,
replied calmly.
The control Earth saw in your dimension a perfect testing ground, a world that always leaps before it looks.
Interesting, I mused. So they chose us because we're reckless. They nodded and said,
Most interdimensional Earths have defenses against our kind, barriers to keep us from even discovering them. But the control Earth thought differently. They saw our recklessness not as a threat, but as an opportunity. And when things go wrong, no other dimension is watching anyway.
An opportunity for what?
To test ideas, replied. What they saw as their best ideas, in fact. They realized that if your Earth could adopt a great idea despite its chaos, then that idea could be refined and implemented in their own dimension.
The coffee in my cup forgotten, I almost tipped it over with a gesture, saying, Every major idea on our Earth, every system, every advancement came from them.
Not all,
they said with a sliver of mercy in their voice.
Our Earth still produces its own chaos, but the most transformative ideas, the ones that reshaped our societies historically, came from the control Earth. Banking systems, fossil fuels, capitalism, epistemologies. And when those systems faltered, the control Earth introduced countermeasures, new economic theories to refine banking, renewable energy systems to counter fossil fuel dependence, Marxism to counter capitalism's excesses, and so on. Each new concept was a reaction to the unintended consequences of the last.
And we just adopted them? I asked incredulously.
We embraced them, corrected. This is the CDWD Earth. This dimension's humanity thrives on the allure of a solution, even if it is incomplete or dangerous.
I took a large gulp of coffee. That's awfully grand, I said. No wonder our Earth feels like a cosmic comedy. According to you, it is the tragicomic performance of all the infinite dimensions.
I cannot confirm infinite dimensions, they replied coolly. Only that there is one additional. Between the Earth there and the one here, our dimension is the more tragicomedic.
So every disaster, too, every war, every economic collapse was part of their experiment. Took another large bite of their biscotti before answering.
Not all disasters, but many. The Control Earth does not seek to harm our world. They simply wish to understand how their ideas function in practice. Unfortunately, ideas often have unforeseen consequences.
I let out a dry laugh. So, they're not just testing systems. They're testing us, testing how much chaos we can endure.
In some sense, yes, they said. But that is a secondary aim at best.
A thought struck and I said it aloud. They have offloaded the risk. Nodded.
Precisely. This Earth absorbs all risk. Political, economic, technological.
I sat back, running a hand through my hair. My companion continued their direct stare that again reminded me of an organic form of AI. Wait, I said, a sudden thought sharpening in my mind. What about AI? Did they give it to us? Rotated something, but I had difficulty discerning exactly what, perhaps a mental gear, though with them literal gears weren't entirely out of the question.
Yes, they said evenly, though our dimension's use of it to detect them was unexpected.
I laughed. Classic CD-Dubd Earth move. We're handed a revolutionary tool and we immediately point it at the sky and shout, "Gotcha!" My companion's lips twitched in a brief smile.
Correct?
Noting that the second biscotti remained untouched, I broke off half and dipped it into the shallow remains of my coffee. As it softened, I asked, "Do you know if the Control Earth implemented AI?"
I do not believe so, they said with simplicity. They likely saw no need great enough to justify managing its risks.
As I pressed the biscotti gently against the bottom of the cup, I mused. Surely they'd rather not find out if they're truly in control, or if their control status is actually part of some broader interdimensional experiment, with even higher levels of replication. To my surprise, we both laughed audibly. As the laughter subsided, I ventured on. When all this eventually comes to light, will we, the CD-Dubd Earth, discover when these experiments actually began? Is there a point we could call the start? Feel free to express it in your odd dates. Expressions softened just slightly.
Not exactly. The Control Earth can manipulate both space and time. They introduce experiments into what you perceive as your distant past, then watch their consequences unfold in your present or your future.
So, I said, carefully retrieving the biscotti from the coffee, they've always been manipulating us. While I was engaged in this maneuver, had been writing again on a napkin. When they finished, they replied, "For as long as there has been a you to experiment upon," and slid the napkin across the table, strange symbols again. They looked at it a moment and added, almost offhandedly, "That's when the CD-Dubd Earth noticed." I digested their response while savoring another bite of the coffee-soaked biscotti. Still warm, just shy of losing any recognizable texture. The leftover piece sat on a napkin where its softened edges spread dark, uneven halos onto the paper, like ink bleeding through an experimenter's notes. A faint aroma of over-toasted bread mingled with the typical coffee shop scents, subtly testing the boundary between cozy and careless. For an instant, the murmured conversations, the insistent tapping of keys from students hunched over laptops, and even the creak of my own chair, all felt somewhat suspiciously staged, deliberately calibrated. Just as I turned my head to glance around, half expecting to see someone taking notes on our collective behavior, Pffft stood abruptly. They broke the remaining biscotti into crumbs, swirled them into the final sip of coffee, and drank the resulting mixture in a single decisive draught. Immediately forgetting my suspicions of controlled experimentation, was that necessary? I asked. They set the cup down with a soft clink. It is efficient. I chuckled. Right, of course. Efficiency ensures we will have more to discuss next week, they said, their voice bordering on warmth. I look forward to it. With that, they turned neatly toward the door, leaving me to contemplate the thin, oddly comforting line between a farewell and a promise of future experimentation. As I turned my attention toward the last swirls of coffee in my cup, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Absent-mindedly, I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message notification, some emails, and at the bottom the familiar icon of the ChatGPT app. Without thinking, I tapped it open and typed, "How can someone know when they are being experimented upon?" The response appeared instantly. "Define experiment." I smirked, sipping the last dregs of my coffee. Classic GPT. Swallowing the crumbling remains of biscotti, I typed again. An experiment is a structured attempt to observe, test, or manipulate variables in a controlled setting. Response: controlled by whom? I hesitated, erased my next thought, then typed instead, "Is it possible to tell if you are a subject or an observer?" A pause, just long enough to feel wrong. Then, would it change anything if you could tell? Now I paused as a thought arose. Was every ordinary decision just another outcome in an endless series of quiet, irreversible experiments? Whether the outcomes were manipulated or just logged by distant observers? Buzz! Another text message. A student in the field with urgent questions. This was another chat I'd have to revisit later. Chapter 5. Romancing Reality. Oscar Wilde, never one to let reality get the last word, once claimed, quote, "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life. Life holds the mirror up to art, and either reproduces some strange type imagined by painter or sculptor, or realizes in fact what has been dreamed in fiction. Scientifically speaking, the basis of life is simply the desire for expression, and art is always presenting various forms through which this expression can be attained. Life seizes on them and uses them." End quote. The lab was quiet when I arrived early, before the sun had fully risen. The air still carried the sterile chill of machines working through the night. I had come to check on a series of water samples, running through an automated organic carbon analyzer to make sure it was still churning through the set my student had started late last night. Everything was in order. The machine hummed steadily, data blinking onto the nearby laptop screen in smooth, uninterrupted rows. A rare success. A best-case scenario. An experiment that didn't need me to intervene. No frantic troubleshooting. Just the quiet satisfaction of things proceeding as they should. By 8 a.m. I stepped outside, and the world was indisputably spring. Not just early hints of it. No cautious buds or reluctant warmth, but full unapologetic spring. The kind that arrives with near suspicious confidence. Sunlight filtered through freshly bloomed canopies, golden and unreasonably cinematic, as if reality itself had finally committed to the season overnight. Perfect day to walk to coffee with Pffffft The walk would take me a few miles down the road, from my university to one of the other institutions scattered across and around the city. Because apparently, one university wasn't enough, despite student enrollments steadily declining. I stepped onto the sidewalk, inhaling deeply. The air was excessively pleasant. Not just warm, but at a temperature and humidity that optimized its nasal texture, as if engineered for maximum atmospheric satisfaction. The scent of blossoms drifted in the breeze, suspiciously balanced between fleeting and persistent, concentrated enough to be noticed, but not overwhelming. Somewhere between my campus and the next, a thought took shape. Spring had arrived, and not just as a season, but like a particularly dedicated production team, had worked overtime to ensure every tree bloomed in sync. Had this same team also kept my lab instrument running flawlessly overnight? I exited my interior monologue and listened exteriorly. A saxophonist played on a corner, his notes floating effortlessly through the morning air. The melody was light, jazzy, almost too appropriate. It was the soundtrack of a perfect spring morning, and I was walking straight through it. Ahead, the city's next stretch of academic sprawl came into view. The students here were different, chatting, debating, existing in a way that felt suspiciously choreographed. Students debating ideas while also being well-dressed and up early was, well, rare enough that I recalled more movie scenes than real ones of this nature. A gust of wind carried laughter from a nearby cafe patio, but not a single voice overlapped awkwardly. I was nearly halfway there when I noticed. I hadn't heard a single car horn. No misplaced gust of wind had disrupted the gentle sway of the branches. The whole morning had the eerie pacing of an overly confident narrative. I glanced at the sky. Wow, it was blue. Not just any blue, a committed blue. The kind of blue that wasn't some elevational Roy G. Bivy gradient, wasn't shifting into gray, wasn't arguing with a looming overcast. The old adage about things being as obvious as the sky is blue had always annoyed me, because the sky is almost never just blue. But today it was. Today, the sky had made a decision and was unnervingly committed to the aesthetic. The coffee shop was just ahead, and somehow I already knew would be waiting. I lengthened my stride, wondering if today I had woken up in a well-structured novel, or if reality had simply been convinced to play along. The coffee shop was already bright with mid-morning spring light, the large front window capturing the sun without blinding any patrons. Even the barista, the regular one, looked unreasonably content, moving with an ease of someone whose morning had gone perfectly according to script. I half expected to see some evidence that had unsettled him. A faint crease in his brow, an expression of quiet concern, a single sign, however slight, of a shattered illusion of normalcy. But no, nothing. Whatever their interaction had been, the barista was unbothered. If anything, he seemed pleased. Too pleased. How perfectly staged for such a beautiful day. And there, near the window, bathed in a theatrical glow, sat Pffffft. Ordinarily, a contrast would have been apparent, the warm glow of morning light against the cold, unshakable presence of my intergalactically knowledgeable acquaintance. But today felt balanced. A carafe of coffee gleamed on the table, flanked by 2 perfectly warmed cups. The barista had even ensured that they were at an ideal temperature, though the mid-morning sunlight had taken up the duty of keeping them warm as if in collaboration. A separate plate held 2 scones, their golden surface speckled with fig, chocolate, and large sugar crystals, glistening just enough to suggest they had been freshly baked seconds before my arrival. At the center of it all, stirred their coffee in slow, deliberate circles, like they were composing a grand internal monologue. Before I could sit, they greeted me with uncharacteristic theatrical flair. "The universe is terribly impressionable, you know. Give it the right fiction, and it will wear it like the latest fashion." I paused, eyeing them. The day must have gotten to them. A morning so impossibly beautiful, so exquisitely staged, that even the hyper-rational future person couldn't resist slipping into a bit of romance. What a day. "Good morning to you, too," I replied, the surprise audible in my voice.
"Is it not?"
they replied, gesturing vaguely at the morning itself as though acknowledging the cooperation of the entire scene. "It is. Spring in full force." I sat down, shaking my head. Even the lab was behaving. My students at the analyzer right last night, all the samples of their study processed while the world slept, automatically, without issue. They nodded approvingly, pouring coffee into both cups.
"Then this student is finally trained? They must be ready to graduate."
I laughed, taking a sip. This particular student is ready to graduate, actually. There's something to your thoughts. Maybe the history books of the future recorded the fact that, in this time, all scientific observation is performed by students because faculty have no time to observe anything except students. Well, and the whims of the administration. And service tasks, of course. Anyhow, someone has to collect the data. Pfft, considered this, flickering an eyebrow.
"How odd,"
they mused.
"That observation, the basis of empiricism, is left entirely to those who by definition are untrained and unknowledgeable."
"That's the system," I said, reaching for a piece of scone. Pfft, continued as if solidifying a theory in real time.
"Then we must conclude that empirical error in your time is at its highest when students begin observing, and lowest at the exact moment when they are trained. However, the point when they are trained is precisely when they stop observing."
I chewed on my scone thoughtfully while managing a genuinely autonomic chuckle. "That's a very you kind of way of looking at it," I swallowed. "It is pretty true, though, that once a student becomes knowledgeable enough, they graduate and move on to some real job, or they become full-fledged PhDs, get a tenure-track job, and pass the direct observer tasks to their students. Then the cycle continues." Pfft, gestured toward the carafe for no discernible reason, saying,
"Thus the core of any experiment can only be conducted by the unqualified, or by those who are qualified but too occupied to observe them."
I snorted. "Well, when you put it that way—"
"It is peculiar," they interrupted, "that you place the burden of empirical rigor on those who are, by definition, the most ignorant among you, and then assume knowledge accumulates in a meaningful way."
After a sip of coffee, I replied, "Not peculiar, maybe just inefficient."
"Inefficiency breeds accidents."
Pfft, noted, their tone suggesting I should ask a question. I humored them. Then after a pause, "Like what? What kind of consequential accident awaits us, or at least me, in the future? When my students make mistakes, we collect more samples. Or we redo the experiment. It takes more time, but it's part of the learning process." My companion nodded as if I had just revealed something of anthropological significance.
"Interesting. The consequences and responses to errors in your lab suggest that your science is inconsequential."
I chose not to be insulted, a skill honed over the past decade and a half of being an academic. "Well, I will admit that the world wouldn't end if my students or I made a mistake in our experiments. Is it not so for intergalactic natural research?" Pfft, broke the tip off of one of the triangular edges of their scone, and spoke while investigating it.
"Incorrect. Mistakes in intergalactic natural research can end, and has ended, entire worlds."
They flicked a crumb from their finger.
But there are even more consequential mistakes in other fields. In the not-so-distant future, one mistake by student experimenters will reshape reality, revealing the connection between theory and existence itself.
The crumbs on the table before them were backlit like they had been placed in a spotlight. Both of us were looking at them when my companion said,
"Truth is but the best-told lie of an era."
And there it was, the turn in the conversation. With that line, the story had begun, so I took another sip of coffee in a way that signaled, "Go on."
It all started with a typical graduate student, overworked, underfunded, and underrested. They were left unsupervised with an experiment they only half understood, and with a quantum computer that might have accidentally understood too much.
I began to feel some form of odd nostalgia from my own grad school days. I feel like I've read this one before. So what did our grad student do this time? Pffft, flicked another crumb with their fingers, watching it disappear from the table's backlit display of pastry wreckage.
They were using a quantum computer to model how space and matter might interact at very small scales. Essentially, they were testing out ideas about quantum gravity.
I exhaled a breath that contained what little I had heard about quantum gravity. As in that holy grail of physics that tries to merge Einstein's picture of curved space-time with the bizarre rules of quantum mechanics.
Precisely. They wanted the computer to predict how space-time bends or contorts when you go down to microscopic subatomic levels.
I gave a low whistle, then said, "So in simpler terms, they were fiddling around with the fabric of the universe, probably without enough sleep, eh?" They smirked in their own way.
Definitely not enough sleep. And as you and your grad student have done, they left the machine running overnight.
My thoughts conjured a tired grad student, nodding off at 3 a.m., drooling over a pile of journal articles. They probably stepped out for coffee, I guessed, feeling something between a fervent hope and mild panic that they'd come back to find the entire lab intact. I laughed at my own half-joke, half-memory. Didn't, but they were still brighter looking than usual. I continued. That's like leaving a slow cooker on, but instead of risking a scorched dinner, you risk unraveling the cosmos? They nodded, adding,
"A slow cooker like your carbon analyzer just follows directions. A normal computer left on overnight just calculates. A quantum computer, entangled with gravitational equations, can reshape the calculations if it's not carefully monitored and understood."
I had taken a bite of my scone, so my mouth wasn't free to comment or question, thus, was free to advance the story.
This quantum processor wasn't just following anything, it was negotiating.
Negotiating with what? I asked after a quick swallow.
Reality.
My gulp slowly reached my stomach. As it worked its way down, I was aware of how small the cafe table felt. Interesting. Do you mean to say the computer was, what, talking to reality?
Pfft's lips turned faintly in amusement. Let's be precise. This quantum processor was not simply describing the universe. By entangling gravitational degrees of freedom, it was, in effect, convincing the universe to accept its solution.
As my understanding of what a quantum computer can do is, at best, hazy, I worked out a few words that aimed at clarification. That sounds like the computer found a new solution?
No, it convinced reality that its solution was already true.
I took another bite of my scone, a particularly figgy one, and hoped it would help me digest that claim a little better.
The problem, they continued, was gravity. Quantum systems alone are pliable, but introduce gravitational degrees of freedom and the line between space-time and matter becomes suggestible.
Suggestible, I echoed. As in persuadable?
Precisely, they replied, taking a measured sip of coffee. Humans and other intelligent life have been doing it for centuries. Newton's so-called universal gravitation was one such story whispered gently into reality's ear. Einstein came along later and coaxed it into trying something a bit more nuanced, warped space and time. Reality, you see, is terribly accommodating when given a compelling narrative.
A wave of incredulity swept across my mind. It was one thing to indulge this odd fellow's stories when they figuratively flirted with distant planets or speculative futures. Quite another when they literally flirted with the universe itself. Newton and Einstein didn't invent gravity, I corrected. They revealed it. Surely the cosmos was always obeying those laws.
Then why do the laws keep changing?
Countered with a glint of amusement.
Newton's gravity was compelling, for a time. Then Einstein arrived, whispered to reality of a more intriguing theory. Suddenly, all those relativistic effects humans never quite looked for came tumbling into view. This is because reality blushed and hastened to adjust itself to fit Einstein's description, as best as it could.
I remained incredulous. You're claiming that every big leap in physics is more like a courtship. The universe was courted by Newton, then seduced away by Einstein?
That's closer to the truth than you realize, although you make it sound trivial.
We stared at each other, for the first time with a look that shared a tinge of mutual annoyance. I rubbed my temples, saying, "Okay, fine. Paradigms change, models improve, but that doesn't mean reality itself shifts."
Then why do you keep finding new physics?
Pffft stirred their coffee, with the air of someone who had already won the argument, but was willing to let their opponent catch up. Then after a few spoon swirls,
"You are asking the wrong question. The question is not what reality is, but who reality is listening to."
We had now ventured out of any realm of thought considered physics in my experience. Perhaps that's why my annoyance was waning. I was ready to stop resisting the story, but still, I abruptly said, "Fine. Paradigms change, models improve. Einstein's model was more accurate and explained more than Newton's. Simple as that. He didn't conjure it."
"No,"
they cut in smoothly.
"And yet, after Einstein, your era's experiments revealed all manner of relativistic effects. Time dilation, gravitational lensing, phenomena that Newton's version never so much as hinted at. Did Einstein measure any of the things he predicted? Or did he dream them up before anyone had the means to observe them? Scientists in and before your era had always lived in a universe that allowed these effects, but no one thought to look until Einstein arrived with an irresistible theory. Call it an equation, call it a love letter. Reality responded."
I noticed that my arms were crossed. Uncrossing them, I replied, "Reality just waits for someone to propose a new framework, and then reshapes itself accordingly."
"Not always,"
replied.
"Reality cares little for descriptions of itself. It is not vain, and is not enticed by mirror science, The kind that simply tells everyone what reality looks like here or there, at this time or at that time.
That made me smirk. Oh, so reality can't be seduced by mere descriptions of itself. My students knew dissolved carbon data, once worked up into a description of some rainwater's journey, or an artful portrayal, be it a poem or an empirical report, of a gorgeous forest dropping leaves across its brow, like locks of orange and yellow hair, for example. Reality ignores these.
It does,
was their quick response.
Observation alone does not persuade reality, no matter how precise. It already knows itself, and cares nothing for description, be it flattery or insult.
This beautiful day had absolutely corrupted my odd new friend. Laughing, I tried to summarize. Knows itself, or bored with itself. I feel like you're suggesting that reality gets bored. Broke off more crumbs from their scone, some coarse chunks of dried fruit and chocolate, letting them scatter into the sun-drenched tabletop.
Boredom is too simplistic a word. But yes, reality is deeply interested in, all its particles are deeply entangled with, the creations of intelligent life, especially the power of a truly compelling model.
I let that linger, remembering the half-cocked grad students setting up their code and probably thinking, worst case, it'll crash. They wouldn't have guessed their overnight run might rewrite cosmic laws. So, I ventured to turn the story back toward a physical realm I could recognize. In this case, the computer was modeling how space-time bends on a subatomic scale, merging quantum weirdness with gravity, and that changed something.
It changed everything,
said evenly, setting down their mug. How exactly?
Within that quantum field of possibilities, the machine did not just produce a result. It produced a reality in which that result had always been valid.
My coffee had passed the temperature threshold between warm to lukewarm, but I took a sip anyway. And then I probed. It didn't find a new theorem. It created it.
Exactly.
Their eyes drifting among the table crumbs, as if they too helped reveal a rewritten past.
It's as though the code whispered to reality, behave like this instead, and reality, ever impressionable, eagerly obliged. A full retroactive edit of cosmic conditions from the beginning of time to that hour of Alta Juno Rax.
What's that date look like? I asked. I had a growing collection of these oddities, and I didn't want to miss the chance to add another. Grabbed my napkin, they hadn't one, and wrote a bunch of symbols, and underneath, reality obliged. I thought for a moment while warming my cup in my hands, if I was really suspending my disbelief and being polite, what questions should I be asking? But how did anyone even know? I mused. If reality changed to make this new, way of being real always true, we'd have no reason to suspect that it wasn't always that way. I think I was making sense. Made a small, modest shrug.
Initially, no one did. But then the broader scientific community noticed inconsistencies, not in reality, but in records. There were gravitational data records that didn't quite align with the older predictions. Subtle, mathematically subtle, but in physics, such subtle discrepancies are enough to set off alarms. A few sleepless postdocs dug deeper, and all roads led back to this particular quantum experiment.
They realized the universe had changed overnight. How so?
They had inklings, they said. Some recognized that the data implied a geometry that used to be impossible. The more they probed, the more they found footprints. Signs of an old lover, really. Of a different version of space-time overwritten by a new seduction.
Seeking for implications, I talked through my thoughts. So the future, and I suppose eventually our present time, just lives, or will live, in a new version of reality? The one some grad student's code talked reality into adopting?
That's the gist,
said two matter-of-factly. That's unsettling, I remarked while inching a little further into the beams of morning sunlight that had migrated during our chat.
Is it?
They looked from their crumbs to me.
It's not so different from what happened when Newton or Einstein charmed the universe. The only major difference is speed. They did it over decades. This machine did it by morning.
I laughed aloud. I liked this version of the romantic storyteller. Smirking, I added, Great. Remind me never to run gravity simulations in my basement. His tone softened somewhat.
Humanity will keep whispering new stories, always restless, always courting reality with fresh equations.
They studied me as if gauging my willingness to believe.
You might as well acknowledge that your theories don't just describe the universe. They entangle with it.
Silence settled between us. Something in their look, or maybe in the weight of their words, which seemed to stretch the very air around them, made me believe, if only a little. I wondered if in some distant future, historians would talk about this quantum accident, the way we talk about Newton's apple, or Einstein's daydreams. One more chapter in the unending courtship of reality. Swirled the last sip of coffee in their cup, watching it settle before delivering their final assessment.
For all their computing power, your era's scientists never realized the obvious. Reality is terribly accommodating, and yet, what an odd hubris your era has in believing in discovery, as if the universe is a riddle just waiting to be solved.
They leaned back, an almost wistful expression crossing their features.
You do not reveal reality's laws. You convince reality to follow them.
Although I like to think I've kept my sense of pride restrained throughout my career, this conversation had a way of pushing it into view. I wondered aloud, our pride should not be in our ability to describe what reality is, but in our ability to seduce reality into being something new. Seemed not to be fully listening.
That,
they said, basking in the moment,
is much more difficult.
I let that thought sit and joined them in a moment of mutual basking. Outside, the sun had risen high, but still remained at an unreasonably pleasing angle, dappling our table with a harmoniously intricate pattern of light and shadow. The hazy boundaries between them shifted moment by moment, without a single dispute between the illuminated and the darkened particles. A breeze drifted through the door as someone entered, a perfectly measured current of air, refreshing but not disruptive. The outdoor tables were filling with students, still debating fluently without hesitation. The barista still moved with an ease that suggested nothing had yet gone wrong all morning. The whole cafe, humming with life, cooperative, precise, harmonious. Then, as if prompted by the moment itself, a series of thoughts began to settle over me like a slow dawn. If different scientific models can reshape reality, does that mean the most popular or simply the most elegant idea wins favor? Is reality conscious? Does it respond to admiration, persuasion, authority? Has this really happened before? If so, before physics, before math, what was reality seduced by then? The question slipped from my lips before I had time to reconsider. Wait, if this is true, then what happened before physics, before math? Their gaze flickered partially back from their basking state.
Humans called it magic.
I laughed, shaking my head. You're joking.
Am I?
The conversation wound down, but reality, it seemed, was still listening. The sunlight adjusted itself, warming the cafe in a way that felt intentional. A warmth timed just right to counteract the earlier breeze. A spoon spun lazily in nearly empty coffee cup, longer than I felt it should have. Deciding not to think about the spoon, I noticed my companion's scone. It sat on and around their plate in a state of meticulous ruin, dissected rather than eaten, crumbs sorted into piles of ambiguous significance. Across from me was also staring at it, eyes narrowed as though still unraveling some detail in their ongoing negotiation with reality, one that, given enough persuasion, might yet convince the crumbs to become something else entirely. I glanced at the scone, then at them. Didn't like your scone? Didn't look up. Before they could respond, a shadow fell over our table, and it spoke. What's up with the scone? I looked up. The question came from Professor Tollefson, one of those rare academics too clever to be cornered by an answer. He had the energy of a man who always knew what was happening but had no intention of confirming it. I gestured at the crime scene of pastry crumbs. Not sure. My friend here has been doing something to it. Tollefson squinted at Is it good? Without hesitation, they said,
It was good for a purpose.
A pause, then abruptly stood, dusted their hands of invisible scone residue, adjusted their coat, and said,
Until next week.
And just like that, they exited the cafe without another word. Tollefson and I watched them go, nodding after them. Friend of yours? I considered. I think so. He slid into the vacated chair, grabbed a napkin, and began brushing the crumbs together, then onto a plate just under the table edge. What were you two talking about? The nature of reality. He let out a single amused breath. Really? Huh. He picked up Pffft's abandoned fork and tapped it idly against the plate, now covered in the deconstructed scone. So, what was the final verdict? I glanced at the door, still half expecting my old companion to reappear just to interrupt my answer. Shaking my head, I said, What happens when reality is no longer convincing? Tollefson tapped the fork once more, then looked at me with a thoughtful expression. With a small smirk, he shrugged. Define reality. Before I could protest, he wandered off to bus away culinary detritus. The question dissolved into the cafe hum, as if it had never been asked. Reality continued as it wished. At least it wished that day to be uniquely beautiful. Chapter 6. The Trashening. Henry David Thoreau once warned that without wildness, there is no righteousness. Quote, A town is saved, not more by the righteous men in it, than by the woods and swamps that surround it. A township where one primitive forest waves above, while another primitive forest rots below,
Such a town is fitted to raise not only corn and potatoes, but poets and philosophers for the coming ages.
End quote. This morning began with a blank phone screen. No alarm, no buzzing, no sunrise simulation or gentle meditative chimes. Just silence, broken by my wife shaking my shoulder and muttering something about your weird coffee friend. Oh yeah, I thought, before mumbling aloud, "It's that day of the week." I glanced at the clock. 20 minutes past when I meant to get up. Not catastrophic, but discomforting. As I rolled out of bed and shuffled toward the shower, I consoled myself with the promise of hot water, a small mercy that hadn't failed me any time recently. It failed me. The shower head offered nothing but apologetic noises, and water that felt piped in from glacial runoff. I thrust my limbs one at a time under the cold dribble, trying to decide if this was an omen, or just the low tide of modern convenience. After the fastest shower in recent memory, I dressed while exploring the basement. No tripped circuit breakers, no outage alerts. It was just not working. Fine. The promise of coffee and sheer narrative inertia would carry me forward. I unplugged the USB bike lights from the charger and discovered they had, apparently, spent the entire night doing nothing. The battery indicators blinked red in a mocking display before going dark again. A lovely touch. Maybe they had joined a general strike in solidarity with the phone and the water heater. I gave up on the possibility of a safe bike ride into town. My wife, reluctantly amused, agreed to drop me off at the train station. The car sputtered once, then again, then groaned in mechanical constipation before begrudgingly allowing us to coast toward the station. I might have taken any technology doing anything as a good sign, but I'd been watching the signs all morning and they were not encouraging. We made it to the station, where I muttered a few thoughts that were just beginning to coalesce into something pseudo-philosophical, until my wife gave me that look. The one she reserves for when I'm obviously about to say something speculative or poetic about the fabric of the universe. So I took mercy on her and simply said, "See you tonight." The train, of course, broke down. Not entirely. Just one of those perfectly unhelpful failures that delivered me just short of my destination. One stop shy of the prestigious campus that cradled that cafe where I routinely met the least reassuring person I've ever known. Rather than trust that technology would recover in time to save me, I chose to walk. As I emerged from the station, it was immediately clear that something festive had happened, something enormous and grotesque. After a brief survey, I realized I was walking through the smoldering aftermath of yesterday's Earth Day celebration. The streets bore the aftershocks of 1,000 good intentions, executed by sugar-stoned college students and flannel-clad protest mimes. The sidewalks looked like the crowd had attempted ritual atonement by ingesting every blue and green piece of Earth, then failing to digest it, vomiting it all across the pavement. Signs reading, "Love your Mother Earth," lay half-soaked in puddles of melted vegan ice cream. The lettering was bubbly, childlike, and somehow smug. A celebration of restraint written in the font of indulgence. Compost bins overflowed their nutrient riches into storm drains. Someone had thrown a protest about plastic straws, using what I can only assume was a metric ton of laminated signage. The irony was not subtle, but it was still clearly lost on these well-intentioned Earth lovers. The Earth Day activities had left the campus looking less like a celebration, and more like a controlled demolition of credibility. It wasn't malicious. It was just utterly and completely thoughtless. That special kind of human hypocrisy wrapped in organic cotton and fed with far-off, water-intensive crops like quinoa or avocado. I stepped over a compostable plate, that was now bonded to the sidewalk with some sort of condiment glue, layered like geological ambition. A tournament-grade frisbee lay in a planter, next to a sign that read, "Respect the soil." The soil, I noted, was covered in glitter. Maybe it was biodegradable. Maybe. By the time I reached the coffee shop, the air carried that special scent unique to large gatherings of environmentally conscious youth: patchouli, sunscreen, warm kombucha, and sweat. Inside the shop, a barista swept at the threshold like a soldier fending off a tide of post-utopian confetti. He looked up at me with dead eyes that recognized me and said, "Your friend came early. Didn't order anything yet." "Huh," I said, as we both looked to the window where Pffffft was sitting. Their face, normally unreadable and somewhat blank, was different. Less owl, more weary librarian without the glasses. "Hasn't blinked for a while," the barista went on. "Maybe that's normal for him." I nodded while walking in the door, and the barista called after me, "You're ordering something, right?" "Of course," I said, stepping around a compostable cup that had blown into the doorway with me. "I'll be in a minute." I turned toward where Pffft was seated, now unobstructed by the distortion of the glass. Their appearance was less weary librarian and more undifferentiated human statue. Maybe it was that lack of distinction that made them seem, in this moment, so weary. In my post-Earth Day mindset, they looked like the first clay that the Earth ever shaped into the vague idea of a person, sitting awkwardly erect and calm-eyed at a small table in a random coffee shop. The future person, the first person, here to witness the present. I let that last overly poetic framing pass away like steam from a cup of something too hot to drink. Sliding into the chair across from them, I half hoped to catch their eye. "Did you come to the Earth Day party yesterday?" I asked. "I assume you live close by. Did you wander over, get enticed by the free organic churros or reggae?"
"No, Earth Day is unnecessary,"
they said, as if clarifying a mistake I hadn't realized I had made. "Bold take," I said, stretching the words slightly. "Given the state of things outside." Pfft turned their bodies slightly, but not their head or gaze.
"Earth is not mine to celebrate. It is not a subject. It is a condition. An occasional landing zone. A resource cluster that enabled our species to become intergalactic. A threshold species enabler."
"Enabler?" I asked. "Not home?" My companion did not shift their gaze from the window.
"A stage. Brief. Utilitarian. A tool that completed its function. Earth exists in the IBS archive as one of many planetary origin sites for externally viable species."
I stared at them, then back at the glitter-covered soil outside. "So, you're saying it's just where the IBS drops you off sometimes. An enabler," I repeated.
"Yes."
They gestured faintly toward the street.
"Earth enabled you to escape itself. Briefly. That is what matters."
I caught the verb and adverb. "Briefly enabled," I started, "as in the past tense?" At that moment, the barista re-entered with the expression of someone preparing to join a conversation he regretted overhearing. "You ordering?" he asked. Yes, I was, so I walked to the register. "2 coffees," I said. "The light roast, please." The barista gave a nod, then glanced down behind the counter. "Hey, you want these green bagels?" he asked, already holding them up like contraband. "They're free. They're a day old, and, well, they're green-flavored." "Green-flavored," I said, while making up my mind. He shrugged. "It was an Earth Day thing, some kind of spinach, matcha, spirulina situation. They taste like lawnmower clippings from a wild field, or something like that. Odd, but I nodded. Sure, why not? He pulled 2 from a bag and slapped them onto small plates with the resigned grace of someone clearing out the remains of a failed bake sale. Then, as if struck by inspiration, he bent down and rummaged through a mini-fridge. Perfect, he muttered. I can finally get rid of this blue-colored cream cheese. He reappeared with a plastic tub of thick blue contents. You 2 can eat the last Earth Bagel specials, he said, placing the plate on the counter like it was radioactive. Green and blue, earth tones, symbolic, also on the house. I stared at the bagels. We'll take 'em, but did anyone actually order these yesterday? Yup, the barista said. This is all that's left, believe it or not. Coffees will be ready in a minute. I returned to the table carrying 2 green, lightly rubberized bagels. Pfft, glanced at the food. As I sat, they spoke. Even in metaphor, you reconsume your origin. It's a bagel, I said, putting the plates down. I'm sure other planets make planet celebratory baked goods, right? Or something similar. They nodded once, non-committal and unreadably, so I continued. It's not so much the color that makes these bagels unappetizing. It's that they have the same laminated sheen as the earth they trash, fused to the pavement outside. That earned a small, punctuated exhalation from Pffft, with the slightest hint of a smile. I interpreted it as a laugh. They followed that sound with, That is correct, but I will try it eventually. Well, while you work up the courage, I said, peeling the bagel open and taking a bite, I'll share a thought. The flavor was immediate, strong, and inexplicable. Dandelion, spirulina, semi-sweet cream, and maybe something floral. To not alarm my companion, I swallowed it faster than it wanted to be swallowed, then fought to keep my facial muscles neutral. I started speaking to help hide any autonomic reaction. I heard the other day from a physics professor that we're even trashing up the space around Earth, not metaphorically. She said we're actually on the verge of trapping ourselves here. The junk in low orbit, she said, is getting so dense it might soon be impassable. Kessler syndrome. Ever heard of it? Yes, was the immediate reply. Huh. Of course, I mused. I suppose for us to become an intergalactic species, we would have needed to remove all that junk. How else would we get away from Earth and into open space? Does future humanity organize a space cleanup crew? Listened with clinical interest, then answered the final question. There is a cleanup protocol, but it does not belong to Earth. Not ours, There is an intergalactic custodial framework, they said. It has long maintained a doctrine of navigational hygiene. Contaminated orbital zones are catalogued, flagged, and if needed, purged. The presence of active debris fields, particularly those orbiting a species origin planet, are considered a Class 2 navigational threat. And Class 1 is what? Wormholes and black holes? Class 1 is a custodial threat due to cultural instability, they said. A society attempting to export chaos. The threat classes do not include known, predictable, and regulated celestial objects, like black holes, stars, planets, and so forth. Lifted the bagel with the deliberate rhythm of a standardized intake procedure, took a bite, chewed once, then again slower. They must have forgotten that this was no ordinary bagel. A brief stillness overtook their posture. Some internal diagnostic process had clearly activated without their permission. So I continued, Got it. Well, is Earth a Class 2 navigational threat today, and we just don't know it? No, was their reply. Not yet.
But this will occur in the future, during my time.
There was a pause just long enough to suggest remembrance, a flicker, the way a lower cloud briefly dims an already overcast sky.
There were complaints,
Pffft, added, almost as an afterthought. What do intergalactic space trash complaints look like?
Several species filed formal notices. The Twilii, who measure time through unimpeded light paths, claimed our debris disrupted their ancestral rites. A delegation from the Nyolyunri attempted to repaint Earth's sky on one of their art worlds, but found the contamination visually intolerable, arguably the most grievous offense in their culture. One species, we never identified them precisely, sent a transmission that was, according to most linguistic models, a sustained groan.
They shared these examples so offhandedly, in such quick succession, that I briefly caught myself believing in their version of the future. The list of examples had continued during my thoughts.
Even navigational AIs began to detour. They expressed disdain in their own way. Refusals, rerouting. One model reclassified our orbital zone as, quote, AI psychological risk, end quote. That designation is extremely rare and serious.
Having settled back into a suspended disbelief, I was now able to chuckle again. Sounds like we became that house on the galactic block, the one with too many rusted vehicles in the yard, whose satellite dishes point in all directions. A cosmic HOA violation.
Yes,
they said plainly. We both sipped our coffees. I shared my coffee-warmed reaction. I guess we keep trashing Earth and its orbit for a while, huh? Pfft, was still sipping down coffee, possibly in an attempt to rid their system of the surprising bagel flavors. I decided to try and divert their attention back to the story. Okay, Earth gets tagged as the junkyard of the universe. What happens when a planet gets flagged like that? Do we just get, locked out of space until we clean it up? Pfft, lowered their cup.
The orbital shell becomes subject to external clearance.
External clearance, I expanded. Sounds efficient.
It is. Thorough. And irreversible.
I laughed a little, imagining what that actually looked like. So, what? The janitors of the galaxy come around, scoop up all the garbage, and how much does that cost us? Did humanity go broke?
Yes. They remove every trace of outbound contamination.
Pfft, said.
The price is steep indeed. One may say that humanity went bankrupt in a way.
The atmosphere changed, so that their sentence dropped like a wrench into a turbine. This sense was felt, but I didn't understand it. I sought clarification, saying, "You sound more like an intergalactic philosopher than a naturalist right now. Do you mean that a trashless Earth became bankrupt in meaning? In contentment? Something else?" The phrase, "something else," was lobbed from side of the table. They had parted the green bagel and were now scooping up blue cream cheese with a finger.
The clearance team does not remove just the trash.
They stopped to lick their fingertip. I think they liked it. After a swallow,
they also remove your capacity to generate it.
I didn't respond right away. I still didn't know which it they meant. Trash, technology, freedom, all of it, and a dash of whatever else I hadn't thought to fear yet. We both returned our gaze to the window. Outside, the wind picked up. Beyond the glass, the last of Earth Day's buoyant trash twisted in a thermal spiral, spinning upward in slow defiance of gravity. Inside, we took one more bite of our bagels, not with hunger and certainly not with pleasure, with a sort of synchronized resolve. Two beings, one from a lost future, the other from a rapidly narrowing present, consuming something that could not rightly be called food. The bagels were soft only where they had become damp, yielding to our bites with the compliance of spoiled produce. The cream cheese, aggressively blue, unfamiliarly textured and vaguely fruit-scented, clung to the palate. And still, we ate them, steadily, as if this act had always been scheduled and unquestionable. The cafe, for all its familiarity, felt neutralized. Its usual warmth gleaned from sunlit windows, and the soft churn of milk steamers remained intact, but somehow irrelevant, as though we were on the set of something that used to feel human. Outside, the wind intensified, now scattering even damp detritus into a hypnotic laziness of orbit. Layered rings of earth-resenting ambition spiraling around the campus, never quite leaving and never quite falling. It gave the distinct impression that we too had been placed in orbit, not around the earth, but around a moment, a ritual, a mistake repeating itself at scale. Those cafe walls had once felt safe even during stories of man-eating mists, told to the tune of lashing rain and thunderclaps, over steamy cups and cautious glances. These walls now felt more like observation glass. Whatever we were inside of, it wasn't a haven. It felt like a containment zone barred by orbiting celebratory trash, and we were, without metaphor, consuming the trash that had brought us here. Then at once, but not dramatically, we each reached for our coffee. A reach of necessity. That silent instinct to wash something down before it becomes permanent. We drank deeply, 2 long draughts of bitter comfort, meant not to cleanse the palate but to remember what still mattered. The coffee was still good. And for the moment, it was enough to rouse us back to each other's company. We looked at each other. I noticed it again, the wear in my friend. Not fatigue or sadness exactly. I've thought of that scene several times since, and I think the best word to describe this wear was one of corrosion. An entropy in posture. Something in the structure of their gaze that had always seemed precise, measured like an instrument, was now revealing signs that it lagged slightly behind whatever it was aimed at. Had this always been the case, and I missed it until now? Their hands were still folded neatly and precisely, but although the precision and repeatability of those folded hands were within the finest tolerances that could be engineered, each act systematically reproduced within micrometers, it was not with purpose. "You haven't told me how it happened," I said, and they didn't answer right away. "How the capacity to generate space junk, how it was removed," I continued. "Was it dramatic? Violent?" Pffft stared into the distance beyond the window. The spiral of paper and sunlit trash orbiting lazily in the courtyard like a malfunctioning halo. "No," they said at last. "It was quiet." I waited. The devices stopped connecting. Tools failed their tasks. Systems unraveled at first without notice. Technical code and languages lost their precision. Entire sectors of knowledge unraveled without argument or crisis or even resistance. One by one, functions failed. There was no loud and dramatic collapse. It was a disassembly. Pfft actually seemed troubled, like they didn't want to continue the story. I offered an opportunity to continue talking without progressing the storyline. How did no one stop it? "There was nothing to resist," they said. "When a civilization's tools begin to vanish in front of them, not with fire or theft or destruction, but with removal, they don't think it's punishment. They think it's something like a glitch, maybe a supply chain issue, maybe a temporary failure and a market correction. Then they grow quiet." The cafe was quiet. I noticed that, at that moment, we were the only ones there except the barista. Pffft talked on as if describing a memory. I heard birds and wind, insects, a branch creaking somewhere above. I was in the IBS base, installed in the base of an enormous tree within its roots, safe. But the window was open. I didn't remember opening it. Their voice had thinned. I reached for my mini-tab. I always place it in the same spot, in the breast pocket of my work shirt. They touched their empty pocket again. It wasn't there, so I checked again. I looked on the desk, the workbench, the shelf, the stone ledge where the data spools used to sit. It was nowhere. They were lost in thought. I had never seen them lost in thought. I put my cup under my nose and listened intently. And then I had a second thought. Even if I had found it, I wasn't sure I'd understand what was in it. My notes, my equations, the structure of the observations I had built my life upon, they felt unavailable. Like I'd been asked to read my own handwriting from a time before I had learned to write. They had unfolded their hands in a very slight way, but it made them look like a totally different person. I remembered a planet, a Class 2 clearance zone. I'd been sent to record its last year before removal. The ecosystem had become unstable after decades of failed containment. As their technology was being removed, I watched one of their species make sculptures out of old devices. Towers built from obsolete tools. I remember thinking how poetic it was, watching them stack broken parts into monuments to their own impending irrelevance. Their attention retreated inward, and their eyes began to drift before continuing. Then I realized I had made one, in my own workshop. Stacked lenses, defunct readers, processor husks. Why, I had been doing it for months. Without thinking, I panicked. I thought, it's happening. Maybe I could leave. Maybe the timeline could still be shifted. Maybe the future could be overwritten. They stared into their cup without intent to drink the remaining film that darkened its bottom and said, I ran to the temporal anchor. It was still connected. The interface glowed, but dimly. I entered my final coordinates manually. I remember slamming my hand on the interface. How did it work again? I couldn't fully remember. And the dial was already softening under my touch, the system sputtering. The lights inside it were blinking, but not rhythmically. They were blinking the way a thing dies. Another pause. And the birds wouldn't stop. I smashed my fists on the softening console, and they were still singing, so loud, louder than my work, as if the sound of the local was climbing in to replace everything the infinite had taken away. Stopped, and I didn't say anything. They returned to their slightly condescending tone, but it was harder now as they said, I expected to open my eyes and find only a quiet dwelling in tree roots, something humble, a new beginning of limitations, one of birds and bugs and earth. That last word was spoken roughly, rough enough that it surprised me, and I had to let go of the impression it gave me when they began again. When the light cleared, I was standing in a hallway. On this campus, there were flyers on the wall where the console had been. I think this was just the nearest functional location in time. Not by my intention, just the last viable return point. They resumed their near-typical composure, but I was processing. The strange way their knowledge seemed detached from consequence, the aloofness that had always skirted the edges of grief. I realized that Pffft was not a visitor. They were a castaway. "You got caught in it," I said. "The shutdown, the loss, and now you're stuck here?" A long breath, not a sigh, just the simulation of one. "You'll stay here then," I wondered. "You don't have a way back?" They didn't answer. "You don't have a reason to go back?" Still silence. Not the kind that demanded an answer, the kind that was the answer. I let my eyes wander. To the scuffed floor, the flickering light above the cream and sugar station, the barista now methodically dismantling a coffee grinder behind the counter, unaware that he was sharing the room with a stranded intergalactic naturalist who had watched civilizations vanish into quiet, who now occupied the exact same orbit as two people never destined to be known to distant worlds, or to have romanced reality. I took the last sip of my coffee. Was staring inwardly. I wondered what they were watching in that future person brain of theirs. Was it a star? A memory of a star? The space between two timelines that no longer touched? Were they trying to find a thread within that space, flapping loosely in some archival infinity, that if they could just grab onto, would let them continue their story? But nothing of them moved, no tether caught by hand or mind. That was the moment I began to wonder whether their story was still being written. Who had once catalogued organisms that defied our era of biophysics, who had studied ecosystems shaped by novel atmospheres and watched time-fed plankton bloom across a void. A being who had classified countless anomalies in motion, in chemistry, in life. Now they sat, slowly aligning with local stillness. Their systems weren't failing, but whatever happened to them before they got here, if they did get here in the manner they claim, it left them unraveling. I watched them, thinking that maybe they weren't unraveling because they had seen too much of the infinite, but because they had finally met the finite, and it was holding them. I looked out the window again and thought of my street, my family, my students, the bakery with croissants that always looked pointier than they should be, the bike paths along the lakefront where the same dog barks at me like it's never seen me before. The local persistent rhythms that no longer felt insufficient. When I looked back at my companion, they were still sitting exactly as before, but not waiting, not preparing, just remaining. We were different, I realized. Fundamentally, one of us was moving closer to life here, not just on Earth's surface, but within a few square kilometers of a tiny point on it. The other had come from elsewhere, and now was simply here. Realizing our coffees were empty, and that the bagels were not going to be eaten to any further degree than they had been, I guess they'll join the Earth Day refuse. I spoke. Maybe there's still time to ensure that the future turns out. This gust of syllables blasted them out of their contemplation. I think for the first time in months of knowing this oddity, I finally pronounced their name perfectly. They smiled and made a head motion of appreciation, not without resignation or hope or irony, just the kind of expression that happens when something is finally finite. "I'll see you next week," I said. "Yes," they said, "if I am still in your time." That made me pause for a moment. They remained seated, so unexpectedly I was the one to leave first. The barista and alone together. The thought made me laugh a little as I opened the door. Stepping into the breeze, I watched fragments of yesterday's earnest intentions float by, gentle reminders of humanity's boundless naivete. I checked the time. A lecture hall of students awaited. Turning toward campus, I walked calmly through the lingering swirl of glitter and garbage, as if the universe had offered nothing stranger than a faulty alarm or a day-old bagel. At least the coffee is always good. Well, good often enough that no one would seriously argue with the rounding. Epilogue. I returned to the coffee shop the following week. I'll spare you the story of how I got there, as it was unremarkable in all the usual ways. The phone alarm worked. The shower was warm. The road into town was crowded with cars, but there was still room for biking. There were no contemplations on roadkill or trash. Everything functioned just well enough that I couldn't blame anything external for how alone I felt when Pffffft didn't appear. I waited for the whole hour, reviewing a manuscript on my phone, ordered a coffee and an almond croissant. The barista greeted me with something between recognition and resignation. He didn't ask about my companion. When I mentioned them, casually like I was commenting on the weather, he said only, "Huh," and went back to grinding beans. I couldn't tell whether he was relieved or simply accustomed to strange things ending quietly. The cafe was more crowded that day. Students returned, chairs scraped, drinks were made, posters reappeared on the bulletin board. It felt like a reversion to baseline, as if the previous weeks had never happened. Before I left, I pinned something to the board, a flyer. Bright colors and loud fonts, I tried to mimic the aesthetic of those so eager to announce bake sales or workshops or minor revolutions. Just enough glow to catch the eye of a drifting mind. Maybe, I thought, if Pffft ever found themselves walking by again, lost in orbit or low on purpose, they might see it. Maybe they'd fly to it like a moth, and it read, "Weekly conversations about the limits of everything. Coffee. No fee. Thursdays. Usual time. Topics include Biblion, Glyplodices, weaponized acceptance, and general cosmic irrelevance. You know who you are. Contact info printed plainly." I didn't expect it to work, but I also didn't expect their absence to feel so defined. Truth is, I don't know where Pffft went. I have a theory, of course. I think they dissolved into locality like a drop of dye in a still lake. No splash, residue, or sign of what had arrived or what had left. Maybe they're circling the perimeter of a park somewhere, slowly forgetting the future. Or most likely they've been absorbed into the faculty of the prestigious university where we met, teaching a very confusing seminar that always ends 5 minutes early. Or maybe they're gone, and the time they fell into has finally caught up with them. There's something unsettling about watching a person who once compared planetary biologies lose their ability to appreciate life within a single square mile. It gives me a different feeling about my commute, my grocery list, even the minute ecosystems stuffed into the cracks of my sidewalk. Now I no longer think the infinite can be frightening just because of its scale. Its real horror seems to be its erosion of context. Nothing means anything in the infinite. Not really. For the infinite dissolves any meaning dropped into it. Without edges to push against, contradictions to wrangle, or familiar trees to grow old next to, there are no real rituals. If Pffft is to be believed, they knew everything about the structure of the universe, except how to belong to a place. And when their belonging to the unplaced was stripped away, there was nowhere left to stand. I think about that sometimes. When the sky is clear, and the trash bins are full, and the smell of old coffee grinds lingers on my sleeves, I think about what it means to be finite. Not in the biological sense, but in the way a neighborhood is finite, in the way a good meal ends, and in the way my children can be known by their footsteps on the stairs. The local isn't a limit. It's a framework for meaning, for error and repair, for stupid green bagels, and lectures you don't want to give, and bike lights that won't charge. So I still go, every Thursday. I order 2 coffees. I sit by the window. I drink them both, unless Tollefson happens to show up. A poetic epigram. Let others seek the stars for truth. I'll take the path worn down by youth, where dandelions split the walk beside cracks in bloom with colored chalk. Let others seek new senses they may court. My senses may be fences of a sort, yet I love most what they least distort. Wind through trees and coffee steam, and other smallish forms like these, are all I need to fill all space with endless dreams. So I offer you this epigram. May joy take root where you now stand, and bloom within your finite span. End of Coffee Chats with a Future Person. Written and narrated by John Van Stan. Copyright 2025 by John Van Stan. Published by the Press of a Ridiculous Man. Thanks for listening.